Dick, let's start with the inauguration of Governor Byrne. What kind of inaugural was it? What was the tone that he was trying to set?
It was by standards of the recent Corzine inaugural, for example. It was pretty fancy. It was still a significant inaugural ball. People dressed up for it and for the event, and there was a big turnout. And it's, in retrospect, you have to remember that Brendan was considered a white knight with potentially a national future, and there was a good deal written about that. And his inaugural address was widely looked at around the country in Democratic political circles. I mean, he was this strikingly handsome guy who had been a hero, had been a navigator in World War II, and he had this great family and this great history as a prosecutor fighting crime. And the state had had scandals under the previous administration and was in another one of its low points in terms of its reputation. It appears to be a cyclical matter that we can't escape. And so Brendan was seen as the person coming to Trenton to clean up the mess and put the state back on an even keel. And this is 1973. In 1972, the Democrats, actually it's early 1974, but in 1972 the Democrats had been routed by when Nixon beat McGovern. And in 73, Watergate is ripening, but it hasn't fully exploded. And when Byrne takes office in January of 1974, Democrats are lost. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, in the subsequent months, Jimmy Carter, an ex-one-term governor of Georgia, whom no one had heard of, was able to capture the nomination because it was wide open. And it's, you have to kind of remind yourself, because subsequently when we got involved in taxes and budgets and other things, kind of national issues fell away. But there was a moment when Brendan got a lot of attention as a bright new star on the Democratic firmament.
What happened to that particular track or channel?
The income tax.
As simple as that.
Yeah, the income tax was, at that time, the introduction of an income tax where there hadn't been one. And I've talked to other governors in other states, ex-governors, about who went through that little fraternity of people who were. It is one of those things that swallows you. It is hard to do. People don't want it. They will fight it tooth and nail.
The income tax itself, or any major sales?
The initial imposition of the income tax, and there are a few states that don't have it because it's always proved too difficult. It's much easier to raise a tax, and of course I can't believe people claim they have courage for cutting a tax. Obviously cutting a tax is the least courageous thing you can do. Maybe the right thing to do, but it's not hard. Raising taxes is hard, and putting a new one in, like a sales tax for the first time, or it turns out an income tax. I mean, as a matter of fact, polls have shown for 40 years that I've been reading them, income tax is much less popular than a sales tax. Neither are popular. But if you hold a gun to the head of the person you're asking the question and saying you must have one or the other, they choose a sales tax, and they choose it inversely with what benefits them. In other words, the people who would be better off under an income tax still insist on choosing a sales tax.
I want to pursue the income tax thing at some length, but first I want to stay with the inauguration. You say that there was a widespread interest in his inaugural address. Do you recall anything about that address? Did you write it?
I wrote a draft of it. The governor rewrote much of the draft. The kind of inaugurals tend often to be things that, in my experience, the governors wind up having a big hand in themselves.
Do you recall anything about that speech?
I should, but I don't.
That's quite.
I know it said something. No, I don't. I wouldn't speak.
Do you recall where the inaugural?
I read a bunch of inaugurals recently before John Corzine's inaugural, and I'd be afraid that I was remembering something from somebody else's inaugural.
Do you recall where the inaugural festivities took place?
Yeah, at the between the State House and the Annex. At the, what is the memorial, War Memorial. Swearing in was at the State House.
How about the ball? Do you know where the ball was?
I don't remember where it was. It wasn't at Princeton.
By the time of the inaugural, were there any loose ends that you can remember from the transition? Cabinet posts still
We
to
still
fill?
had a couple of posts to fill. I wouldn't swear to the exact date of them. It seems to be David Bardeen was a little later than the inaugural, and there was at least one other. I can't remember. We had the key people in place: Attorney General, Treasurer.
Any issue or policy problem from the transition that needed immediate attention in the first weeks of the administration?
Well, we had passed legislation during the lame duck session to bolster the bonds for the sports authority so that the Meadowlands could be built. The main thing that was filtering out and becoming an issue was the fact that there was a budget deficit of proportionally quite large budget deficit. One of the reasons I jumped from the inaugural to the next phase is because we had a plan to unfold the need to address the budget deficit over a period of 4 or 5 months. In other words, to educate the public, bring along the press, bring legislators into the conversation, make people realize that we had been misled, all of us, and there was not a surplus, there was a deficit. And it was a substantial deficit, the biggest up to that time, and that something dramatic would have to be done, including a new tax or additional, or raising the rates of current taxes, and then maybe eventually come to a point where people said, well, the only fair way to do it is an income tax. We favored an income tax, but at that time I think it could have wound up going another way. But I think it was no more than a couple of weeks after the inauguration when the governor indicated that he was persuaded that we needed an income tax. In fact, what he said was he was persuaded by me that he needed an income tax.
How did you feel at that time, that he had
I
blown
could
the
have
plan?
done without the publicity.
You were his new state treasurer.
Right.
Do you recall the context in
Well,
which
I'd
the
also
remark
been
was?
his campaign manager and, his director of transitions. Everybody knew that we were pretty close.
Do you recall the context in which he made the remark?
It was very like the way he made the promise not to have an income tax during the campaign. He was out somewhere, I can't remember where, and he answered a question. And I can't remember where it was. And he said something, literally said something like, Dick Leone's persuaded we need an income tax. Whatever persuades Dick persuades me. And that was it. We were suddenly in the game. And I didn't see any point in lying about it. I admitted that we were looking at different tax structures and ways to make them fair. And
So
a great
then
many
what-
people came out against it immediately, so we were already in a hole.
Who came out against?
All Republicans and most Democrats.
And various interest groups as well, I would assume?
Yeah.
How about
The business community particularly was pretty negative.
Newspapers?
The newspapers split. And at that time, some papers that are not very important today were quite important. The Trenton Times was an important paper in political circles, and they were for the tax.
They were owned by the Washington Post?
No, this is just before that.
Uh-huh.
And they were still owned by the City of the family. No, not Scott. Local
No,
family.
okay. Was there any opposition to hiking the income tax within the cabinet or the?
Well, there wasn't an income tax at all, remember this?
I'm sorry, was there any opposition to imposing an income tax?
Yeah, there were people in the cabinet, particularly those with strong political backgrounds, who thought this would be a disaster.
Recall anybody in particular?
Ed Craybill, I remember. My reaction to all of that was, yes, it will be a disaster. It's the right thing to do. We have no choice. We could try to patch together something else, and then we'll have another crisis next year. But you can't. I never took the position, and neither did the governor, that it wouldn't be a political disaster. We thought we could recover from it.
Was the idea to do it early?
The idea was to do it early. In the first or second year, actually, it's always been said that this is when we were thinking strategically. We didn't think it would be the end of the world if we failed in the first year, because it would be an object lesson to people when we cut the budget and when we went through everything about how much was at stake, and maybe there'd be more support. We were of a view that something like this that people don't want ought to be hard to get because it's a democracy, and therefore you're going to have to go through a process. Naturally, once we were in the process, by the time we got to June, from our perspective, I think I might have mentioned that I think the most common mistake you make in politics and government is to confuse the experience you're having with the experience that people are having. So the experience we had been having for 5 or 6 months made it seem to us like, well, by now everybody knows how bad the financial situation is, and everybody knows we don't have any choice, that we don't want to do this. So we got to push this through, and we made a big push, and we did pass it through the Assembly. And we fell 1 vote short in the Senate.
You got it passed in the Assembly?
Yeah.
And you fell 1 vote short in the Senate.
Yeah.
Why couldn't you turn that last vote?
Almost identical to what happened to Hughes. Passed the Assembly and fell short in the Senate.
Uh-huh.
Well, I think we weren't willing to pay the price.
Which was?
Just as Hughes wasn't willing to pay the price.
Which was?
It never got explicit.
Somebody would
But
have
it was
needed
clear
something big.
they needed a lot, yeah. I don't think like one thing, like an agreement about the way things would be done. And I don't think we were particularly skillful at dealing with the legislature initially. I mean, the later generation of Hughes aides, the Harold Hoduses and the Bob Mulcahy's and others, they were much better than we were at dealing with the legislature. We used the powers of persuasion and sweet reason, which have limited utility.
How difficult was it to get the Democratic legislative leaders to get behind the income tax?
It was very, very difficult. We actually, in the Senate, the Assembly was okay, but in the Senate, Pat Dodd was the leader, and Jimmy Dugan was the state chairman in Hudson County's leading representative in Trenton, so he was equally, in some ways, roughly equivalent. And they were very tough. We had a core of people who were very supportive.
Who?
Al Burstein, Matty Feldman, Bill Hamilton, Steve Persky. We went through the fire with those guys. It was very hard on them. And it was a kind of situation that doesn't seem to be quite the way it works now. We had a coalition of the willing, as they say, and we met with them often. I mean, I met with them all the time in the Assembly and the Senate. We met with them several times a week, going over
to plot strategy?
No, mostly going over what we knew, what the facts were, what was, I guess, strategy, more tactics. Who was out there, who we needed to educate, what groups needed to know more. I mean, I went on the road, and it turned out for 3 years, was out almost every night.
Really?
Yeah.
Trying to sell an income tax?
Yes, going before. It was a good experience. I was actually about 6'5" when I started it. I would have, going before groups and,
6'5", that's funny given what later
yeah, I know.
would happen.
College or high school auditoriums and Rotary clubs, and union halls, and especially party meetings, where, because you rank, county committee people and others, township committees and others, trying to convince the Democrats to understand what we were talking about. It was fascinating because we had a very progressive income tax initially, that was tied to property tax burdens, and it had a circuit breaker feature, which means that the amount of tax you paid would depend on what the total burden was relative to your income. So it was different town by town for property taxes, because it was all dedicated to property tax fees. The income tax, and it still is all for local governments. And it was town by town and income by category by income. We actually had a book and hotline telephones. You could call in and say, my name is Joe Smith and I make $25,000 a year and I live in this town and my house is assessed at this amount. And we'd tell you what your property taxes would be and what your income tax would be.
Let me ask a question along those lines. Did that formula make it a tougher sell in that it was complicated? You couldn't say to somebody, Well, your taxes are going to go up by X amount. Do you think that complication?
Yeah, I think it might have been more difficult, although I think at that stage it wouldn't have been decisive to have said anything else. People are, it sounds attractive to say it's across the board, but people are highly skeptical. If you told them now, the income tax raise is $10 billion and it all goes back to communities, otherwise they'll be on the property taxes, they would disbelieve it. And then we put it on as a constitutional amendment, and it is constitutionally dedicated. But people have a high degree of skepticism, which is justified in many cases.
How did the Republicans handle your thrust leaders, Dumont, Kane, Bateman?
Well, Bateman and Kane and Dumont are all interesting because at one time or another in their lives they'd all been for an income tax.
Prior to this?
Yes. Dumont had favored a sales tax but said he would go for an income tax as a last resort, just as Hughes had favored an income tax and said he'd go for a sales tax as a last resort, which is interesting. I think early on there was some thought, which in retrospect turned out to be a fantasy, that one or more of those figures could be captured. Early on, I would say, too, it became clear to me that they would never be for an income tax that was one that could actually pass. They weren't going to be on it. And that was partly, I don't want to get into their heads, there were forces at work in the Republican Party then, which remember were in the 70s, which was the late 70s, which was the beginning of the tax revolt and the movement right in the Republican Party, and the litmus test of taking the pledge. When Bateman beat Kane for the nomination, Bateman took the pledge and Kane didn't. And when Kane ran the next time, he took the pledge. Right, he drank the Kool-Aid, right off the bat, so there wouldn't be any doubt. And unless there'd be any confusion, he had a couple of more swigs of it, changed the name of the arena. But it was their party had changed. Clifford Case had been defeated.
Well, you're jumping ahead of us.
Yeah, I am, but I'm just trying to understand the forces that made it so difficult. On paper, there was a moderate wing of the Republican Party, and it should have been possible to pick off some of those people even easier than some of the sort of machine Democratic politicians who were from really quite conservative places.
Okay, you brought us up to June of 1974, but you didn't get the income tax passed until August or September of 76?
76.
What happened in the intervening?
And it seemed like it lasted longer than that.
What happened in the intervening years on this issue?
It never stopped. I mean, there was never a moment of respite from it because we were always under budget pressure. And Byrne refused to put together a package of nuisance taxes and other things.
Why?
To buy time. Because he felt this was something that would solve the property tax piece of it. Remember, at that time, property taxes were even a bigger factor than they are today.
Were they?
Oh, yeah. New Jersey has I think I mentioned this the last time. New Jersey used to be 50th in the state's share of local expenditures. I mean, we were that bad. So we were a lot of catch-up to do. And he was going to make this happen one way or the other. People thought he would relent. We had to cut the budget, and we actually cut the budget by 1.7% in actual dollars. In other words, it was lower in dollars. It wasn't a cut against inflation. It was smaller.
What took the hit?
Everything. And that led to an explosion. So we were fighting on two fronts, which is we were fighting everybody who wanted government services because we'd cut them. And we were fighting everybody who was against the government because we wanted to raise their taxes. It was an unenviable couple of years. And it went, in retrospect, we had even more at stake that first year than we understood. And I think, actually, this is jumping ahead, but as an aside, when you think about it, I think that influenced Florio very much on grabbing everything right away, because you didn't want to be like Byrne and drag it out.
What do you mean you had more at stake that first year than you thought?
Well, not getting that done meant that the predominant overwhelming issue for the whole first term would be the tax. Byrne did a lot of exciting things later. He did some important things in the first term, but most of the ideas were stunted because we were still in the tax fight. It was one long tax fight. He was about the tax fight, and his popularity plummeted.
You said he was about the tax?
He was perceived, I mean, when people thought about Brendan Byrne, this is the guy who wants to give us an income tax.
So national interest in him dried up quickly.
Yeah, it dried up so quickly that if we jump ahead to 75, 76, when he's deciding whether or not to run again, actually, I'll tell you a story. This is a little off, but this is something that just happened 2 weeks ago. Anyway, the Carter administration wouldn't have anything to do with Brendan. Now, Brendan Byrne was the first governor in the country who endorsed Jimmy Carter for president. He endorsed him in 1974. The summer of '74, we brought him to Morven. I thought Brendan was crazy to bring this ex-peanut farmer. Where was he going? Brendan said no. And they would do nothing for him. They wouldn't make him ambassador to Ireland. And that is a true fact, which Brendan sort of likes to muddy. But I'll tell you, I saw a memo recently. It was given to me by somebody who came across it in their files. It was in the Carter White House. And it was about me. And it was during the Carter transition in sort of 76, 77. And my name had come up for a post. And somebody had written a memo back saying, you know, I've heard good things about him too, but I think the identification with Byrne is poison. I don't think we want to get near that.
That would have been early '77 or late '76.
It's very funny. And it, obviously I never knew about it. I never knew that it even happened. But Brendan became a symbol of something else. And he scared a lot of people on the tax issue for a long time. Until he was reelected.
In retrospect, what should you or could you have done in 1974 to have gotten the tax through then?
I'm not sure. I mean, we passed a sunset law, we passed sunshine laws, we put in the Department of the Public Advocate, we did the clean government thing. We had Billy Highland and Bob Del Tufo was head of criminal justice, and we had, you know, first-rate team. And I think in a matter of weeks, people felt, okay, the government's honest again. We can trust the government. And we were more or less fanatical about that. I mean, we had changed the way the Treasury did business in every area, and we brought people in to demonstrate that. So we fulfilled that campaign pledge. It was different. I think we had very high-quality people, by and large, and there was a sense of that in the public. And I think we didn't do two things as well as we might have. I don't know if they'd have gotten that extra vote. We didn't effectively communicate that we were being austere, that we were saving money. As the 2 years wore on, I mean, we did things like massive car recalls, and we took the erasers off the pens to save money. We had used both sides of the paper. We had massive programs to turn out the lights. And that stuff would get in the papers. And there was a sense that we were watching pennies and nickels and other things. We didn't do any of that initially because we were caught up in the taxes and the budget. The second thing is we fashioned a budget built on the income tax, and we didn't make the cuts until we failed to get the income tax. So there never was a choice of do the income tax or this will happen. I mean, there were abstractions about what would happen, largely about property taxes and other things, but they were not concrete. There was not a hit list. Not all these things will suffer. And we didn't have groups out there energized. We didn't have strikes. After the first year, I used to be quite benign in my reaction when our labor guys would come in and say, we might have a strike if we do this. I'd say, well,
that's what you needed.
We need, you know, we're going to need the income tax to avoid these strikes.
Did you, in the second year, just out of curiosity, did you try that, try to show two budgets, one with
yes.
a tax and one without?
Yes, we did. And, but the second year, I think we were close again. I think the second year, there were two problems. One is the legislature was up. And the second problem was right until the last night. Actually, right until the last night, they were convinced we'd cave and go with, paying on the sales tax and higher licenses, fees, and alcohol and cigarette taxes. And that was, I think, when we put in the unearned income tax, the last night.
An unearned income tax?
Yeah. That was a huge factor in ultimately getting the income tax. Cliff Goldman, my deputy, and I had learned something, and obviously had learned a little bit in a year or two, that at midnight on the last night of the budget, you could sometimes get things passed without them even being read, let alone completely vetted. And we decided that it would be wise to have a couple of taxes in our back pocket that we could live with that might fill whatever gap was left. And we came up with a very progressive tax on unearned income, 1.5% to 8% was graduated. Unearned income is like, interest on bonds and stock dividends and things like that. And they passed it at the last minute to fill the budget gap. It was a pretty substantial tax. And it took a while for word to get out that such a tax existed. And then, of course, the people who it affected were the wealthiest, most powerful people in the state. And two things happened. One is they went crazy. Although nobody could make things any worse for us. I think Brendan was down to about 19% by then. And the second thing was they said, if there's going to be a tax like that, there should be an income tax on everybody, not just a tax on us. And I got blamed for that, and was particularly people in the Princeton literary community who get royalties, which it turns out were that was a plain mistake in the drafting. Royalties were treated as unearned income. They're obviously not. We eventually fixed that. But by the time that had happened, and that was the year Jaws was so successful, and I don't think they ever quite forgave me for that, even though we did change it. They were convinced.
Peter Benchley did Princeton.
Yeah, they were convinced that this was a scheme.
Had other states tried that?
Oh yeah, Connecticut had one for a while.
So you and
Luke
Goldman...
Hayden's father, Luke Hayden was the governor's counsel, got caught in this trap and had to pay a lot of taxes. He had a company he'd had all his life, and he sold it that year.
Huh.
And that helped. I think that wound up helping. The unusual thing politically about the income tax is when we eventually got it, it wasn't that people thought, well, this is all going to work out. I think no one thought that Brendan Byrne was going to be reelected. So they did the tax in spite of that. As they really did, in fact, feel there was no choice. And so did the public. The public hated the income tax, but they felt, by then the polls were getting to be pretty clear, they felt it was necessary. I hate it. I mean, it sounds like one note, but maybe my perspective in Treasury, that the tax looms so large in that first 3 years, but it was big.
An alternative to an income tax would have been a statewide property tax.
Yeah, we looked at that.
What did you think about it?
We looked at that. Here's what I think. I don't think we have the taxes we have accidentally or because of a plot. I think better than most things, they reflect the political reality of our state and of other states. And the reality of our state is that people like the idea of living in towns where there are other people like them, with about the same income, and about the same housing stock, about the same schools, and about the same values. And they will pay a premium for that. They will pay higher property taxes than they otherwise would have paid, to have their own police chief, to have their own school district, to have their own school board. I don't think people are idiots. Even though the school budgets are held at a bad time of year, if people were really in revolt, how many of them would have to turn out to overturn that? You know, they do elect these same local officials over and over again. I think a statewide property tax, which came as a substitute for the existing system, and then the money got reallocated, would be very tough in this political culture. It obviously exists in other places. There are strange examples around the country, but they have different political cultures. Ours might get there someday. Might even be something that comes up this year out of in 2006 out of the big property tax reform movement. But that seemed by any measure harder than an income tax. And there's another reason, which is still true about income taxes and sales taxes and property taxes. The fairest way to raise money is according to ability to pay. The fairest tax is a graduated income tax. And it's fairer now than it was then, because in the last 30 years, most of the income gains have gone to the top. In fact, in the last 30 years, average hourly working class people, adjusted for inflation, haven't seen any increase in income. Now, if you want to tax something to meet an increased cost of services, you ought to go where the ducks are. That's where the money is. And the income tax still remains the fairest tax. The least fair tax, by the way, just incidentally, is the lottery and gambling. It's worse, much worse than property taxes in terms of who pays.
Worse than sales taxes?
Oh, much worse. Not even close. 50% of the money comes from the bottom 15% of the population.
The dreamers.
That's why Jesus was right when he said the poor will always be with us. You buy lottery tickets.
What else stands out during the first term? You mentioned the ethics changes.
Well, I mean, there were some examples of that. I mean, Ed Krabiel had questions raised about some of his activities before he joined the government, and Brendan basically forced him to resign. I mean, it was a Caesar's wife kind of thing. It wasn't a trial. It might not have been fair.
At what juncture?
That was early. That was the first year. That was a significant event.
Did Brendan suffer? I don't mean privately.
Well,
I mean, did publicly? Did people take it out on him?
In the party, it was an unpopular move.
Why?
Well, Krabiel had been around for a long time. He was a leader of Middlesex County. He was pretty well liked. He had run for governor in the primary. It was seen as a holier-than-thou attitude. Brendan was seen as having around him, too many people who were kind of outside this political culture.
Do you remember what Krabiel was accused of doing?
I don't, actually. I don't know.
You mentioned the public advocate. How important was that?
That was a kind of revolutionary idea that you would empower somebody to do a bunch of things, but also to sue your own government, sue your own administration.
Was that unique to New Jersey, or was that copied from someplace else?
I think this was an idea that was New Jersey homegrown. There may have been other similar kinds of things, but I don't really know of them. And Stan Van Ness was known to be, of independent mind and stature, and he knew the government. And he upset a lot of people. He did sue other cabinet members. And, and he was in the room. We had a different approach to judgeships and county prosecutors. The people in the room for those kinds of decisions, Bill Highland, Lou Caden, and others John Degnan, were cut from a different cloth. And I think we had a much higher quality group of people.
They were less part of the political culture and more interested in quality?
We wound up actually getting fewer nakedly political requests because people recognized that it was hopeless. We were hopeless.
Apart from the income tax, what other issues or priorities did you face as treasurer?
We wanted to do personnel reform. Every administration wants to do personnel reform and civil service reform. And I have to say we accomplished very little. It took a lot of time. there's a stare that you get from certain career employees that, without ever saying a word, communicates the notion, I'll be here long after you're gone. And it really works. They get you to a point, you get to a point on this issue where you have to decide, is this worth it? I'm not going to get much. It'll probably be mostly undone. And because I'm doing this, I'm not doing some other thing that I like to do. Now, we had to get the Meadowlands off the ground. That was extremely time-consuming. We had the financial crisis in New York, which undermined our own bond rating, although we held on to the AAA, but it undermined our cities dramatically, particularly Newark and Camden and Patterson. And I dreamed up this qualified bond program, which still exists. I just came across it a couple of weeks ago. I had no idea it still exists.
Explain it.
If the town qualifies and meets certain criteria, the state backs the bonds, stands behind the bonds. It's almost like an insured bond. And you get access to the market, you get much lower rates. It's actually, for a state like New Jersey, it's a reasonably wise thing to do if you also have some control over how much debt there is. It would be a good thing to have for higher education, where they've got runaway debt. The state doesn't stand behind it. Nobody tells them how much debt they can have. But if Montclair State gets in financial trouble, New Jersey's going to have to bail them out, and so on. So that, we had to fight our way through that, and that was an interesting media battle, because the New York Times insisted on lumping us with New York, which had defaulted on bonds, both the state and the city. And even the New York people insisted on saying, you know, this was happening everywhere.
Did you call the New York Times?
Oh, of course. And I called Peter Goldmark, who was the budget director for the state of New York, Governor Carey.
Did the Meadowlands, did the sports complex get built during these years?
Yes, and in fact, it opened it opened on the day of the first withholding of the income tax. Did I tell you this story last time? Well, we went to the opening, and it was a Friday, I think, and it was the first day of the withholding of the income tax, and the state police had to take us out of there because it wasn't safe. So.
What do you think that was, the fall of '76?
That was the fall of '76. We had spent a lot of time getting it done, and it was a great success because it was brought in on budget. I'm forgetting the name of the guy who ran the project. He was terrific. He did a fantastic job for the state. That's pretty hard to do.
Bring
a project like that,
project
on time, on budget.
What part of government would he have worked for?
We got him from the Prudential, and I don't remember if he was a Treasury person or if he was on the authority's payroll.
We want to ask you about the people you worked with in the Byrne administration that first term, and ask you to tell us a story or a recollection of a list of people, starting Bill Highland.
Well, I had met Bill Highland during the Hughes administration. When I was on Hughes' staff, Highland was the president of the Board of Public Utilities, and I would sit with him in the back in cabinet meetings. And we would make fun of other people in the meeting. Highland was a classical clarinetist, played actually with the New York orchestras. He wound up being executor of Benny Goodman's estate. He played with Benny Goodman, a remarkable man, a remarkable lawyer. And exactly what the state needed at that time to put life back into the Department of Law and Public Safety. And
he was your hire then?
Yeah, I'm very much in favor of him, and Brendan went along with him too.
John Degnan.
Degnan was a guy who came, young guy, still a young man, but he was a very young man who came out of Essex County, who Brendan had spotted and steered down to Luke Hayden and me. And he was, in effect, Lou's deputy, and did a great job. He went on to be probably the outstanding Attorney General in the years I've been around.
Stanley Van Ness.
Stan I knew from the Hughes years. He was on Hughes' staff with me. And he, soft-spoken guy. a thoroughly decent guy, absolute straight arrow. Seemed, and we believed, I knew him better than Brendan did, but we believed that he would actually do things with that department, would be independent, and would sue people. And so Stan comes into it because of the department. We might have gone to him for something else, but when we talked about the department, I would always talk about him as the kind of person we could get. Today, I think there'd be a broader range of people you could pick from, because there's much more public interest advocacy around.
Was it hard to convince him to come in and take this brand new position?
No, it wasn't. No, it was pretty exciting.
Alan Sagner.
Well, I think I mentioned Sagner to you. Sagner came out of nowhere. We had, the campaign finance chairman was Archibald Alexander Jr., who was a really nice guy, but couldn't raise a nickel.
This is ringing a bell, yes.
Yeah. And this guy Sagner was actually raising money, and we looked into him. And interestingly, this does not happen very often when you find a wealthy guy raising money. The only thing you had to worry about is how far left he was. Fair play for Cuba. And I mean, he was, Alan is an old Rooseveltian, unreconstructed liberal, and still is. He's a guy who hasn't become more conservative with time. And so we got him involved, and I eventually made him the finance chair of the campaign. And then he wanted to be treasurer after the campaign was over. Alan's about 20 years older than I am, so I don't think I think everybody thought I'd go in the governor's office. It was what Byrne thought. And we thought that with his construction experience as a real estate developer, and with the fact we'd come to know how much we could trust him, that transportation would be a great place for him, and he'd kind of revolutionize the place, and that we could get him a deputy who knew a lot about transportation and public management, and have a good team over there.
Who'd you get?
Manny Carmelo, who was at that time at the Kennedy School, but who had been in government several places, and was actually also from Newark originally, from the Ironbound section.
And how did Sagner do in that role?
He was very successful, and he became a member. We put him on the Port Authority board so that we had more coordination with the Port Authority than normally would be the case. It upset them greatly that we did this.
Why?
I know a little bit about that agency, and its independence is premised on playing one state off against the other, and having people. The way I put it to Tom Kane, who asked me why did everybody I put on the Port Authority forget all about me, I said, because the only appointment you got where they go to lunch at 21 instead of Don's 21. Port Authority puts, particularly these Jersey guys, it puts them in a different world with different kinds of people in New York, and they're going to different kinds of events, and they see themselves as outside the Trenton political culture. We wanted somebody who was not only inside our tent, but knew the issues really well. By that time, Sagner did. And we had Peter Stengel to run public transportation. Peter, you might not know, but Peter went on to be the head of the MTA, and he rebuilt a great reputation there and went on to do things all over the world. So we had a great little team in transportation.
For those who don't know, you say you know a little about that agency. You would later become chairman of the agency, appointed by Governor Florio, is that?
Kane.
By Kane?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No.
That's a funny story, but that's the way it happened.
Joe Hoffman.
Well, Joe was very close to Brendan Byrne. I knew him, an able fellow, wanted very much to be Attorney General, worked in the campaign as a volunteer, but had a substantial role. I forget what department I had him running. Labor was a big come down for him. And I think he did a credible job there. There was a rough economic time, remember, runaway inflation. And there were 2 or 3 issues I had to handle.
What was his background?
He's a lawyer. He's one of their, for example, during the energy crisis, I was named czar of the energy response thing in the government. And we had to deal with everything from the alternate day license plate, the scheme, from the few times Brendan got national attention, positive attention for this complex scheme. Odd number plates and even number plates on alternate days. But we were very busy. And we had a lot of labor-related issues because people were getting killed. People on fixed incomes and people on pensions and people on things. Joe was very good during all that. He was part of the team. And at that point, he also helped on the Round Valley Spruce Run Reservoir, which is something I worked on to try and finally get that thing going. And I have to say, we were astonished to find that he was going to run, that he in fact was going to run against Byrne in the re-election campaign. I mean, we had to cut people a lot of slack for not being completely loyal because things were so bad and Brendan was so unpopular that you just have to, people being people, you have to be realistic about how much you expect. I mean, you expect a very small number to be totally loyal and go all the way down with the ship. Others you'd expect to, you know, maybe be on one of the boats, but at least waving goodbye. Joe, though, you know, became a candidate.
Ralph Dungan and Ed Hollander.
Well, Ralph Dungan was a holdover. By coincidence, he had actually been my choice for that job in the first place under Hughes.
Chancellor of Higher Education.
Yeah.
But under Hughes.
Under Hughes, and he was still there under Byrne. I thought that would work out fine, but they did not get along.
Brendan and Ralph?
Almost from the first day. You know, it was one of these relationships where Ralph didn't feel he got enough support or respect from the governor. And I think the governor felt Ralph was too needy. And, you know, Ralph had a lot of enemies by then, and, you know, they played a little differently. I don't think Brendan had any intention of getting rid of him. But it got to be difficult, awkward, impossible.
How long did it last?
A couple of years. Yeah, a couple of years.
And then who was Ed Hollander?
He was a higher education official, I'm forgetting in what state, New York. And, you know, he was a result of a sort of short search, contracted search, and brought in as a professional to run the department. And Ed ran the department pretty well for quite a while. It's a job, or was a job, doesn't exist anymore, where there'll always be great tensions with the colleges. And that's true around the country. I mean, this is a fairly common structure around the country, although they're called different things, and there's always tensions about it. I mean, ultimately, it's about having somebody who say, no, you can't all have bicycles. We'll have a bicycle here, and you'll have a tricycle, and you get a little cart. And we can't afford bicycles for everybody. And we could use a little of that now.
David Bardeen.
David Bardeen was involved in EPA in Washington, and a lawyer, a pretty distinguished lawyer, and that's how we found him. He did a good job, I think.
Back to higher ed for 1 second. Ed Blaustein was the president of Rutgers.
Right.
What was he like?
We got along really well with Blaustein. I mean, Mason Gross and Ed Blaustein, which were the two people I knew in the years of Hughes and Byrne, really cared about the state in a larger sense and about building up higher education, and weren't just turf protectors and sort of only for Rutgers. So from that perspective, which is a Trenton perspective, maybe different here on the Rutgers campus, that worked out pretty well.
Bardeen, you say, was an EPA official?
Yeah, I can tell you about one anecdote about Bardeen.
Do?
He was an Orthodox Jew, and he didn't work on Saturdays, so he'd start work really early on Sunday. I mean, really early. He would call at 7 in the morning on Sunday. And finally, something snapped. I told him when he called one of those mornings that if he ever called me again like that, he'd be out of a job before he knew it. And we laughed about it later, but at the time, it turned out that he was calling everybody. He would get up Saturday, Sunday morning and catch up on all the business he'd let go for a day.
Anne Klein.
Um,
She was Commissioner of Human Services?
Yeah, she was commissioner. She was a primary opponent of Brendan Burns and had been president of the League of Women Voters and was kind of the good government candidate. Brendan was the anti-corruption candidate, but he was close to these political bosses. Anne Klein didn't have any political support, but she had a lot of citizen support, and she ran a surprisingly good race. And she was named to that post because of the belief that she would be an advocate for those disadvantaged people who were served by the department.
Was she?
Yeah, I think she was very successful. I think she's beloved and remembered that way. And she got along famously with Byrne after joining the administration.
She would try to run for governor later.
I don't think actually run, though. I think about, fool around
Test
with
the
the
water,
idea.
yeah.
Test the water, yeah.
Jim Sheeran.
Sharon was one of the North Jersey lawyers who was a buddy of Brendan's. Sharon and Buddy Bianco, who was banking, was now one department, were brought in as reliable people. They'd both been, I think, assistant prosecutors in Essex. I know Bianco had, and I think Sharon had too, so they'd worked for Brendan when he was the prosecutor. And
He had to deal with auto insurance, which,
right.
as I recall, or as I'm told, was it an issue back then?
Well, it's always been an issue.
How did he do with that?
He did pretty well if you judge it by how badly that's been a problem at other times.
Who were your key deputies?
In Treasury?
Yes.
Well, Cliff Goldman was my deputy, and Dave Beal was executive director. There were no chiefs of staff then for the departments. Earl Josephson was originally a special assistant, but with responsibility for purchase and property, and then he became the head of purchase and property. Kevin Sullivan was a young guy who did a lot of the political things for me, and then he moved on, and I've actually lost track of him.
When you say did a lot of the political things for you, what does a treasurer need to do?
Press releases, speeches, meetings with legislators.
How about Aron Kramer, whom we spoke to?
Aron came back. Aron left to go join the Carter campaign. Aron didn't stay for very long. Let's see, 75, yeah. I mean, I don't think he stayed a whole year.
Did you hire him?
Oh, yeah. I hired him during the campaign.
During the campaign.
Because he could write. Tell you the truth, I can't remember how he came for an interview, but he was a Columbia Law School graduate and gone to Yale. Actually, it was George Pataki's roommate. The weirdness of things. Either at Yale or at Columbia Law School, to both places. And he came to try out for the job, and I gave him something to write because he said he thought he had some PR sense, He thought he could do, I said, you want to do analytical work? We don't need a lot of policy staff. We've got lots. He said, no, I think I could actually be more helpful on the speeches and politics and other things. I figured that was probably nonsense because he didn't have a lot of experience, and I gave him, I can't remember what it was, a couple of things to write, and he really wrote well. It's probably the best writer we had.
In the whole
in the campaign.
Apparatus? In the campaign.
Yeah.
Who was Burns' communications director?
Herb Wolf, who I had known well and recruited out of it. He was at the Trenton Times then. And,
was the communications director or press secretary considered one of the top chiefs the way
there were
it is
5
now?
or 6 people who were in the room when something happened. I always use that phrase, "in the room," because that's where everybody wants to be when something important is happening. And often, the people who are in the room are not even the people with titles. They're just close to the governor or the president or whatever it is. And in the case of this campaign, actually, the 4 or 5 people who would be in the room when something important was going on, or in the early months of the administration, were all people who had formal jobs, and Herb would be one of them.
You mentioned that Brendan Byrne, despite his early backing of Jimmy Carter for president, couldn't even have gotten an appointment as an ambassador, and you said to Ireland. Would Brendan Byrne have been interested in something like that?
Well, this is a story Brendan and I bat back and forth. It never came to, I'd like to be ambassador to Ireland. No, we won't do it because you're too unpopular in New Jersey. It was bandied about, the ambassadorship to Ireland. Remember, there were a lot of things going on, including people who were not necessarily enemies of Brendan Byrne trying to help him out and get something for him, because running for re-election, I mean, the conventional wisdom was stated very well by Herb Klein, when I said, "Don't you think it's significant there'll be 11 candidates?" He said, "No, I think Brendan will finish 11th. So there were people trying to help him. And he did make a visit to the White House to kind of talk about what might be available. He and I have slightly different versions of what happened.
You were with him?
I was not in the room with the president in that meeting, but I was in the White House for one of those meetings. Met with Mondale.
What are the respective recollections?
My recollection is that it was made very clear that they wouldn't touch him, until after the re-election, their own re-election. Brendan's recollection was that it was softer than that. They weren't eagerly offering him ways out, but they didn't say, nothing. I hope he's right.
Could you talk a little about how are we doing there, Steve? Good. Could you talk a little about the summer of '76, which has become part of the legend of this state's political life, the Supreme Court's role and getting the income tax actually...
The special session?
Yeah.
All-nighters?
Yeah.
We finished the budget with a terrible mess. Just something patched together because we were in the court and everybody knew this wasn't going to last a year.
What were you seeking in the court?
Well, we weren't the plaintiff. The plaintiff was seeking to force the legislature to meet the court's mandate.
Did the administration have anything to do with the lawsuit?
Yeah, I think we had a brief. And
did you encourage the lawsuit?
No, I don't think. This had taken on a life of its own going back to Cahill v. Robinson. And so we didn't have any idea where this was going. This is interesting. For all our relationships, we didn't have any idea until just practically the end of what Hughes was intending to do, which was to close the schools, to announce the schools couldn't open unless they were properly financed.
Hughes was the Chief Justice.
He was the Chief Justice. And, but the atmosphere of crisis had become palpable. And for the first time, the politics had shifted to this extent. The people who were, well, there were the absolute opponents of the income tax who didn't care what happened, were never going to vote for it. Then there were the people who weren't going to vote for it because it would be politically fatal for them, but they knew you ought to have it. And then there were the people who were willing to support it. That group in the middle was becoming discouraged and fatalistic, that they weren't going to be able to get away with not voting for it. They were beginning to feel real pressure from the teachers, from parents, from their local towns, from their school districts, because everything was held out. And remember, we'd cut the budgets to the bone, and people were screaming. Property taxes were going up. Programs were cut back of every kind. Labor was in arms. The state teachers either were or just had been on strike. The public employees had gotten zero that year. Nothing. No cost of living, no increases, zero. and practically, I mean, a little more than zero as an average for the 3 years. So the constituencies who really had a stake in this were beginning to become potent. And the antis had been weakened by this experience because they had no real solution. And I think, I always view the court decision, we went on, we went on for weeks and meeting after meeting after meeting. When the court decision finally came down, it still took a while, but I think there was a sense of defeat in the eyes of those guys we had been talking to for all these years. The court said what? The court essentially said they would close the schools because they weren't meeting the constitutional mandate for thorough and efficient education.
How long after that did the legislature meet and pass an income tax?
I don't remember. It might have been a week, 2 weeks. We had several all-night sessions. They kept on modifying the tax. That's when the rebate was invented instead of the credit. The direct tax relief was going to be in the form of a credit. I was holding out for a credit, arguing that, this gimmick of having a check was just an extra expense. And at the last minute, that was one of the things they wanted the checks to go out, which turned out to be very good for Brendan Byrne.
The rebate was part of the income tax.
Yes.
It was built into the legislation.
Yes.
And they're still debating that credit versus rebate point as we speak.
Yes.
Do you think there was any back-channel communication between Byrne and Hughes on what the court would do?
I don't, Brendan would know whether there were or not. I don't know. I mean, I talked to Hughes during that period because I always talk to Hughes. I don't know what, but I don't think it constitutes back-channel conversations.
Could somebody question the appropriateness of the executive branch
Well,
Chief
if you don't
Justice?
talk about the case.
Pardon me?
If you don't talk about the case.
Okay.
I mean, I think you can talk to people as long as you don't talk about the case.
You think that more recently than that era, today's era, for example, that conversations between the governor's office and the Chief Justice go on?
Yeah, they do. I've had a couple of breakfasts with the Chief Justice to talk about issues like pay for judges. I mean, as long as we don't talk about a case where there's some conflict, I mean, it's a part of the government. So.
Whose idea was the rebate, do you recall?
I don't know. I have a vague recollection. It was one of the state senators who was supporting us.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
All right, so the income tax passes, signed into law. Is there a feeling of, what's the mood at the signing of this?
Oh, the mood was terrible. There was a sense of relief among those of us who'd been doing this forever. We were just exhausted, just completely exhausted, too exhausted to celebrate. And there was a pervasive view that it was, tantamount to a resignation letter by Brendan Byrne, that he would never be forgiven but for this, and that 1977 would be a calamity for the Democratic Party, and the end of and Brendan would probably not be the candidate. First of all, I'd say if you'd gotten everybody in the room, in our circle, the majority would have said that he wouldn't run. The next largest group would have said he would lose the primary, and then the rest would have said he'd lose the general. The one person who thought he could run and win was John Degnan. I distinctly remember when in the room, the one person who was insisting it could be done was John Degnan.
What did you think at the time?
I thought it would be very hard. The actual conversation that went on that night was,
the night of the signing?
Of the discussion, no, of the decision, which was a little later, to go ahead again, was my questioning John about what was his evidence, and he said he didn't have any. And then Brendan said, well, then what do you think? And I said, well, I remember this pretty well. I said, this is like we have this big ocean liner, and we're trying to get it in this little berth, and there's 1 inch of clearance on either side. And if everything happens perfectly, we can dock it. But if it rocks a little bit to one side or another, we'll never recover.
Do you think Byrne thought he could win a second term?
He obviously came to think that.
What do you think he felt that night of that discussion?
We then took a poll, which was much worse than we had imagined. It was the worst poll I've ever seen for somebody of Democrats. We just polled Democrats because we had to get through the primary.
How bad was bad?
We put a question in saying, are there any circumstances under which you would vote for Brendan Byrne for re-election? And 69% of the Democrats said no.
Wow.
Remember, he won the primary with 28% of the vote as a sitting governor. 28% of the vote. People go back and look that up because they think it can't be true, but you could look it up, as Brendan would say.
Well, let's continue then with the income tax and talk about a little more about the dynamics of getting this through the legislature.
Well, as this sense of inevitability grew that August, after all those many months and years, there was an attempt to work out an arrangement with the legislature that would be sufficiently different from the tax Byrne had been proposing so that people could claim credit for having improved it. And the rebate came up in that context. As I said, I can't remember who brought it up, but as a different way of getting direct property tax relief to people from the circuit breaker arrangement, which we had proposed, which is administratively cheaper, but was not as dramatic as getting a check in the mail. In addition, a couple of legislators began to be entranced with the idea of a gross income tax, or a tax that was more on gross income and had fewer deductions. It was less graduated and had simple levels of payment. More modeled, I would say, on Pennsylvania at that time than on New York. We developed 4 or 5 alternatives. In fact, if my memory's not failing me completely, there was even an alternative that Tom Kean liked, that he said might attract some Republican support. Cliff Goldman would probably remember that part of it, some part of it. Legislative leaders who had not been willing to vote for the tax in the Senate began to talk about how they had a better alternative, fairer tax, closed loopholes, was more of a level rate. It was less progressive, but that was not.
What was the range of the rates? Do you recall?
I think it was 2 to 2.5 or something like that. It was low. Again, without the deductions. And that began to emerge as something where we might put together the votes. This was a close-run thing till the very end. You would pick up a vote and then lose a vote, and somebody would change their minds. And half the time, it was a cry for attention. And the other half the time, it was just cold feet at the end.
And who was quarterbacking this? You?
No, it was really all of us. By this time, we all had relationships. We'd pool our information. There'd be groups of people we'd become close to. I mean, there were legislators I really talked to every day.
Who?
Well, Al Burstein, Persky, Feldman particularly stick in my mind, Bill Hamilton, more than most people. And they were working this through. I would talk to Dungan and Dodd a lot, inevitably. I don't know how constructive those conversations were, but they were part of the process.
To who and Dodd?
Excuse me, Dugan.
Dugan.
Dugan and
Right.
Dodd. Dugan and Dodd.
And was it now seen as gross income tax or graduated? Were they two distinct
over
things?
the course of these long days and nights, it began, there were 3 or 4 taxes actually that emerged. They were all income taxes, and suddenly the conversation had changed from anything but the income tax to who's got the best income tax. Saying it now, I guess it would sound like we thought we'd won, but it didn't feel like it at the time. We were so close to it and had suffered so much from it. And particularly, I think there was this sense in the administration to go through all of this and then get something that wasn't any good. And that kept us from just leaping and grabbing one of these alternative packages. And that resulted in bargaining right up until the end. to try and make the package as good as possible.
30 years later, when you pay your state income tax, how do you feel about
The price I pay for a civilized state. 30 years later, I'll tell you this. Everybody said, oh, everybody will flee from New Jersey. This will mean the end of economic growth here. High-income people will move away. Well, all I can tell you is this. The states that were at the bottom 30 years ago are still at the bottom. And New Jersey has moved up to the top. Today, people constantly talk about how people are leaving the state because of the income, because taxes are too high. First of all, the state is growing, so more people are coming in than are leaving. Secondly, among Americans who leave the state or stay here, in other words, citizens, people have higher incomes who are moving in than the average income of the people moving out. People want good schools. They want a good environment. We put in a lot of environmental controls under Brendan Byrne that began to turn the corner on that. They want good roads. They want college opportunities. They want to be with other people who are successful and like them and live reasonably well. And, you know, they pay taxes for it. New York City has much higher taxes than New York State. Every time I'm stuck in traffic in New York City, I say to the cab driver or whoever I'm with this, isn't this wonderful that everybody's left town because of the taxes and we can move around so smoothly? I mean, it is a myth. It is not supported by the data. There is no evidence of it. In fact, economic growth is greater in high-tax environments than low-tax environments.
We shouldn't go too far down this tangent, but I just have to go one step farther. Didn't Hughes and Seneca, our economic gurus, just come out with a report saying we're losing our luster as a high-income state?
They came up with it. They took anecdotal evidence, which is what it is about particular industries, and generalized from it. I consider that a mistake. They will be right half the time. They generally are in predicting recessions and booms in New Jersey.
Okay.
But that's a micro-analysis. We could look at a particular industry and say, we're losing ground in that industry. We're not losing ground in telecommunications and pharmaceuticals because local property taxes are too high.
It's for other reasons.
Other reasons. I mean, we're a high-cost state.
1976, the income tax passes. What's the status of casino gambling in that year? Was that the year it went on the ballot?
Well, it went on the ballot twice, and the first time I think was 75, 74, 75. Went on early, and it was defeated narrowly. And then it was narrowed in terms of what it would do.
How so?
I
How
can't
broad
remember
was it?
the exact details.
It was broader than Atlantic City the first time?
Yes, yeah, it had some other things. And there was a massive, I opposed casino gambling. Bill Highland and I went to the governor and said, we can't support this. If you want us to resign, we'll resign. We're going to have two cabinet members publicly campaigning against it. In fact, I think we co-chaired the anti-committee. I think Tom Kane was on it.
Why get involved? Why just not stay out of it?
I believe publicly sponsored gambling is predatory. It plays on people's false hopes, and it's very regressive. It hurts low-income people the most. I would be for high-class casino gambling with black ties or something, or for, you could even argue for some kinds of programs that pay things up. But first of all, the state keeps 70% of the revenue from lotteries, and the remaining 30% is redistributed to one person or 7 people. Now, casino gambling is a little different because the payout is higher. But over time, what you do when you roll that many numbers is you redistribute income as well, too. I'm more troubled by...
Liberals believe in redistributing income.
Yeah, but not that way. Not taking a bunch of poor people and saying, you'll get all the money. Now, I'm less troubled by casinos than I am by lotteries, which I think are particularly, would be illegal. They're bait and switch. But a couple of other things. I feared that and Bill Highland feared that it would bring organized crime back into the state in a big way. It appears that that hasn't happened, but it worried us very much that we didn't think we needed that. Secondly, we both thought it would become disproportionately influential in New Jersey politics.
Has it?
Not as badly as it could have been without the restrictions on funding, but it's still very powerful and influential in New Jersey politics. And finally, we were not convinced that it would be upscale. We thought that it would open the door to what you see in other states, which is, slot machines everywhere, gambling. And now they're talking about how you need slot machines to save the racetracks. You need slot machines everywhere. And it's a slippery slope.
Why? Well, how strongly was Brendan Byrne in favor of casinos?
He was very strongly in favor of it. He thought it would revive Atlantic City, and he was prescient about the fact that it was coming nationally.
And when you offered to resign because you wanted to campaign against it, what was his reaction?
And he said, no, don't. You're welcome to oppose it. He was very good about that. And I've been opposing it ever since, and as you know, it's now pervasive across the country. It's been a particularly discouraging fight.
How do you think it's fared as an engine of economic revitalization for Atlantic City?
Well, it's been very good for the people in the business. Atlantic City, a block or two away from the Strip, is still a pretty sad place. They've got that expensive school and a few other things that have been built. And it redistributes income, provides jobs to people who might not otherwise have it. It's unionized, and they have pretty good benefits in here. So it's not at all negative. But on balance, I just as soon not see it.
Did Brendan Byrne try to get a line item veto? We have
He has a line item
veto.
veto.
We have a line item veto. Right? Was he instrumental in
He expanded what people did with it. Brendan used to actually change the numbers in appropriations. He took the line item veto to a level of creativity that hadn't been seen before.
How did he get away with that?
It didn't get challenged effectively, and because the risk it would be approved. I think there was fear about going after it, because the language, as I understand it, is pretty broad.
Were you involved in?
Oh yeah, we used to sit at the budget bill and with other things, and we'd make little changes by hand to the draft. It was kind of fun.
Where would you do that? In his office?
Yes.
Did he use a red pen, or is that
No, he always used a blue
figure
pen.
of speech?
Didn't he use a blue pen? I think it was always a blue pen. It was always on the side of good government. It was, he never fooled around with it for any. But that was one of the reasons it was enjoyable. Say, this is wasteful, or that's more money than they need. He never increased any appropriation.
To what extent would you say that Brendan Byrne and you, his top lieutenants, came into government with a broader view of the powers of the executive branch than your predecessors?
I think we did because we had a certain kind of political independence, that we could exercise those powers. Part of the constraint on the governor's powers in New Jersey is political reality. For example, you get to appoint all the prosecutors and all the judges. That's the envy, and all the cabinet members. Other governors envy that. But if you have those powers in a political system where you're highly constrained and there are other powerful figures you have to satisfy, you could spend months trying to work this out. You still have Senate confirmation and other things that are handicaps. Because Byrne had 70% of the vote and had come in as a reformer, he was more willing to exercise those powers than would typically be true. He wasn't bogged down as much in the process. There were disadvantages to that, too. I think that's one of the reasons.
There were disadvantages?
Yeah, I think some of the people felt we weren't responsive to them, some of the other people in the Democratic Party, and they punished us when they could.
How?
Not voting for things, blocking appointments.
New Jersey just decided to create a new position of lieutenant governor. Will that diminish the role of the governor?
No. The question is how to make the lieutenant governor into a meaningful position. Will it just be ticket balancing slot that then becomes a catastrophe if you have an accidental governor? Or will it be a stepping stone to somebody running statewide? We don't have many statewide figures. One of the powers the New Jersey governor has that's not written up anywhere is that he's the only one anybody sees or hears, and that's reinforced by the lack of television. So you really dominate the press, and you have the voice, the bully pulpit. People don't know who anybody else is. And will Lieutenant Governor be known, or will this be something where we poll a few years and 5% of the people can name the person?
What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how it will evolve.
Do you think it was a good move to create it, or unnecessary?
I think it was okay, and we've been through such a traumatic period with, for various reasons, people stepping in as acting governor for a long time, and the question being raised that they weren't elected statewide. Personally, the other cure, which would have been to have forced the Senate president to stop being the Senate president and be the acting governor, would probably make more sense from my point of view, because I think Cody was good at being acting governor because he was so politically experienced. I could imagine a lieutenant governor who came out of nowhere and was thrust into that job and would have a great deal of difficulty.
Can you sort of make the same statement about Don DeFrancesco?
He should have gone, it should have been, yes. I mean, he was certainly prepared for it. Went off the track for some other reasons, but.
John Corzine has also called for creation of an elected state controller, although I think he's now bowed to the wishes of some legislators who would rather see an appointed state controller. But were he to get his way and there then be 3 statewide elected executive branch officials, would that weaken the power of the governor?
Yes, it probably would, but that's part of his purpose.
To weaken the power of the governorship?
John believes that while you can make the argument that a strong central executive is the best way to run things, that we've forfeited that argument because of the way things have happened in New Jersey, and that having other ambitious, admittedly ambitious, self-serving, powerful political figures who are trying to make their names by exposing weaknesses in other political figures is a better check on the government we have, whatever ineffectiveness or reduction of power it involves. He believes this strongly. I mean, I've argued it with him, that it's just something we need, and it's pretty hard, having been around New Jersey all these years, to argue that we don't need something. I mean, it may be a series of unfortunate coincidences, but setting more watchdogs on the system who are visible, where their own self-interest may even be to reduce the power or question or challenge what governors do, may be a good idea.
Well, let's get back to our narrative. 1976, you finally get the income tax passed, signed. You're sitting around discussing whether Brendan Byrne should stand for re-election. Most people in his inner circle think either that he should not or that he can't win. Then what happens?
Well, ultimately, it was very much Brendan's decision to run again. There never was a groundswell. There never was strong support for the idea. It was a very personal idea that I think I mentioned that he thought about going to Washington and got no encouragement at that end. Within the party of the 21 county chairmen, Democratic county chairmen, 14 would not support him and did not support him, including from some very big counties. One of his cabinet members announced he was going to run against him,
Joe
Hoffman. In the legislature, we didn't have anything like a substantial group of people urging Brendan to run and be at the top of the ticket, since they thought that would hurt them. In the fundraising community, we were nowhere. Just to jump ahead a few months, when he did decide to run in the primary, we had to get everybody who was part of the effort and on staff to sign notes for, I don't know what the maximum was then, $800 or $1,000, because most of us didn't have that kind of ready cash, to collect enough money to have a little bit, to start the campaign going. We had to persuade a couple of key people to be part of it.
Who?
Well, one was Alan Sagner, who was crucial to having credibility in the fundraising community. Even though he wasn't going to do a lot of fundraising, he had this network of people, and he had to convince people that it was not crazy to support Byrne. Dick Coffey was one of the 7 who wound up supporting Brendan, but it was not at all clear that he would do that.
Mercer County.
Yeah. Then, I don't know if you want to get into the strategy of how to do it.
Sure.
People have gotten a lot of credit over the years for that campaign, but in fact, there were a couple of very simple ideas that animated our strategy. Brendan would say he was sorry for having said that we didn't need an income tax. And in fact, we did. He would run on the income tax. He would be unapologetic about that, but he'd be completely, abjectly apologetic about having misled people on the income tax. The second thing was, so it's a little more technical, we would get as many people as possible to run and divide the primary vote. And I spent a great deal of time convincing people, if they couldn't support Brendan Byrne, to have their own candidate. Partly that was successful because they thought Brendan Byrne was going to finish, as I said, 11th out of 11. And partly it was successful because as the field began to form, better Brendan Byrne than some of the other people. But they couldn't bring themselves to support Byrne. The outstanding example of that was the political boss of Essex County, Harry Lerner, who would have defeated us had he supported Congressman Bob Rowe. We would never have survived that.
And why didn't he?
And instead, he became willing to put his own candidate, Ralph DeRose, who had run the first time 4 years earlier in the race, and split that vote.
How many candidates ultimately ran?
11 or 12. I don't know. Harry and I had a very long night's discussion of this, and I can remember how it ended, and I will tell you this anecdote. Who gets to see this tape? Because I feel a little bad about it, but it's very funny.
This tape is for posterity.
Well, I liked Bob Rowe. And I think Bob Rowe was a terrific congressman and actually would have been a reasonably good governor. He was a guy with quite large ears.
Right. That's
important for this story. I don't know why, but at one point in the evening, Harry Lerner looked at me and he said, the guy looks like a taxi cab with the doors open. I'll put Ralph in the race. So you asked me to explain why that happened? That was absolutely critical. It wasn't about anything substantive or political or anything else. He clearly was having problems with the notion of supporting Rowe. He didn't like Florio. Florio was in that race too. He didn't want to support Florio from South Jersey. The only logical person to support was Rowe, which might have brought other people into it and would have driven other people out of the race.
From Essex County?
Oh, impossible. Byrne was going to be killed and defeated, and the Byrne people, including me, as he always pointed out, did nothing for him.
No patronage appointments.
No. At least you'll talk to me, he used to say. And I would always say, I enjoy talking to you, Harry. We have good conversations. So I don't know. We got this big field, and then we did this. We did a primary based on that, and how we won the general is a different story. But surviving the primary was very hard. It was really hard. It was a close run thing.
What was your thinking at the time about your own personal career, given Byrne's prospects?
Well, I wasn't planning to stay in New Jersey politics. That's funny in terms of what happened subsequently, but I was prepared to move on. I'd considered the episodes in New Jersey politics to be sidetracks from what I really wanted to do, which was be part of the national government. And I thought I might go to Washington. The Carter administration was still going on. I'd been offered a job that I wasn't interested in.
Do you want to tell us what that was?
Yeah, it was it's an irony because of what I wound up doing later in my life. It was to be the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And that didn't interest me at all.
You would later become president of the Mercantile
Yeah,
Exchange.
that's one of those weird coincidences in life, but it would just happen to be a regulatory commission open at a time when I was... Walter Mondale was my great supporter in the administration, and this came out.
He was the vice president.
He was the vice president. So I wasn't interested in that. I was teaching, and I wanted Byrne to be reelected. I wanted the things he stood for to be ratified, and I thought one more campaign. And I became kind of stubborn about it. There were people like David Garth, the media consultant, who'd done the media in the general election the first time, not the primary, who refused to join the campaign this time because it was a sure loser in the primary. And it kind of got to the point where some of us just felt like, damn it, you know, we'll show them all.
We're going down with this ship if it goes down.
No, we'll win. We'll show them all. We'll win this thing. No, we began to believe somehow we would win it.
The primary.
Well, the whole thing. We premised it on a simple fact. If you went to the people and you said, you know, he had to do it, and you made the race about the one thing everybody thought we should fear politically, that ultimately they'd do the right thing, that ultimately, kicking and screaming, they would say, yeah, I know he had to do it. I mean, I don't like it, but I know he had to do it. Well, if you believe that, then you have to vote for him. That we could make that case. The opposition was going to run a race based on never should have happened. Clearly, we didn't have to do it. We can do something else. And that they would seem to be liars. Because by now, after what the state had been through over the 4 years, people would know, I guess they had to do it. You know, all those terrible things that happened, all those cuts. And more than any campaign I can think of, and I've seen a lot of them, it was a simple dialogue between us and the people. The other side helped in the general election by falling into the trap of really lying, coming up with a real BS solution about Bateman-Simon plan, the BS plan, about how an alternative to the income tax. And the primary was tougher because Democrats were all over the place. People weren't paying attention. We just had to survive the primary, and you do that by having a lot of candidates.
You say you won the primary with 28% of the vote?
Right.
For a sitting governor. Why didn't...
Probably some kind of a record. Well, I mean, to win with that.
Why didn't some of those primary challengers get together and narrow the field?
I think they thought Byrne was no threat, so they didn't even consider him. I mean, they really, several of them I know, and who really thought they were going to win.
Who?
Well, Florio figured he'd have the whole South. Now, Herb Klein, I don't know what was going on with Herb Klein, but he thought he was going to win.
What was his rank? What was his office at that time, Klein? Was he an assemblyman?
Hmm? Yeah, I think.
He worked with Bob, though?
Yeah, he worked in the government. He had been an assemblyman. He was later a congressman.
Right.
Briefly. But I don't know why. I mean, he was the Passaic County candidate. The other thing was the organizations felt they all had to have their own candidates. Paul Jordan was going to be, he was the golden boy. He was going to win.
Hudson.
The others didn't want to be the Hudson candidate. And then Paul Jordan lost, you know, the mayoralty, which was a couple of weeks before the gubernatorial primary, and he was done. The Jersey Journal changed its editorial endorsement.
Was Bateman an easy winner in the Republican primary?
No, it was a tough race with Kane. And it turned on taking the pledge that the income tax would be repealed no matter what.
Who took the pledge?
Bateman.
He would repeal the income tax no matter what.
No matter what.
Is that what did him in?
It was his alternative. No, that was fine. People wanted to hear that. Then he had to offer an alternative. Then the press, because of what they'd been through, pretty much demanded that he offer an alternative. He couldn't quite escape the questions. It wasn't like people were going to give him a pass. I mean, the press corps had lived through these 4 years. They knew you needed to come up with another multi-billion-dollar alternative. So he said, I'm going to turn this over to the former Secretary of the Treasury, Bill Simon. And Simon came back to him, and they had a press conference at which the Bateman-Simon plan was announced. And it was total bullshit. There's no other way to describe it. It wasn't even a good fake plan. And I remember I had a press conference, and people asked me what I thought of it, and I said, the Lord has delivered them into our hands. Because that's when I thought we were going to win. We're still way behind in the polls. But there was no way that plan could stand
I
scrutiny.
thought you meant you were going to say that the Lord has delivered them into our hands by calling it the BS plan.
No, we didn't. I didn't use that much, actually. Other people did. And in fact, there was a debate shortly after that, and Brendan got a question, started answering a question, and Bateman explained his plan, and Brendan got up and said, look, did you understand that? I didn't understand. You can have the rest of my time. Try again to explain it right. Bateman turned beet red. Brendan in the second campaign was a different person. He was the Brendan Byrne we see today. He was loose and funny and tough and relentless and never complained about campaigning. He was a different guy. And he was determined to win. And I think I might have mentioned these numbers. The turnaround was unbelievable. We were behind by 26 points on Labor Day. And we won by 16. So it started to move in September. And it was literally palpable movement every day to make up that many points.
Could you feel it by mid-October?
I could feel it by late September. I was sure we were going to win.
Were you still treasurer?
No, I was not. No, I'd resigned.
At what point?
The beginning of the year.
Beginning of '77?
Yeah.
To run the campaign?
Well, at the time I resigned, it wasn't clear there was going to be a campaign. And we didn't really decide till February or March to go ahead and do it.
Why'd you resign?
I wanted to go back to teaching. I wanted to get on with my life. I was exhausted. Sounds funny with a campaign coming up, but I was exhausted. And, I'd done about as much as you can do.
What was your role in the campaign?
It was an unusual campaign in that I ran the campaign, but I had no formal title. I would have a meeting in the morning and lay out what we were going to do. I had total control of the media and the polling and didn't share that with anybody else. We wrote one check for the media in the general election campaign and put it in an account. And nobody else saw the polls, including Brendan, because I thought the polls would be demoralizing. Frightening. But, it was built on a personal relationship. The sort of operational part of the campaign, the field offices that get out the vote, that was all run by the campaign people.
Who were the key campaign people?
Well, Henry Luther, Harold Hodis, Ed Riley was involved at that time. Trying to think of, Jeff Laurenti was writing campaign stuff. I'm going to forget people, probably unfairly.
Were you there every day?
Just about every day. The headquarters was right over here on Route 1 near Princeton. And
Were
I
you
would go
teaching?
for the morning meeting.
Were you teaching at Princeton?
Yeah.
At the Woodrow Wilson School?
Georgia Wilson School.
Where you going?
Yes.
So you get this sense by late September that there's this tremendous change in the political landscape. The one-term Byrne is not going to be one-term Byrne. That must have been very gratifying.
It was exciting. We had done a commercial in the first campaign in which Brendan stood in front of a house and talked about how he was going to ease the burdens of these people, but he wasn't going to raise your taxes or something like that. I don't remember what it was. And we went back to that house and we did the same commercial saying, 4 years ago I told you I wasn't going to do this. Sometimes you have to learn the hard way or something. I don't remember the language. And that had a tremendous impact, that ad. And towards the end, we could switch our message and begin to talk about what a good governor he was. All the other things he'd done, public advocate, sunshine laws. And the numbers just kept moving. When the bond, I think Ray always says that it was the rebate checks, but the election was lost before he had lost the election before the rebate checks came out.
How should Bateman have run his campaign?
I think he should have run the campaign by saying, this tax was, I'm going to roll this tax back. They've spent too much money. I'm going to make sure that it's real property tax and tie it to real property tax reform. And talked about property tax reform. He didn't talk about that. He forgot about that. He was like a state senator focused on the state budget and how to replace this bunch of revenue with some other bunch of revenue. And inflated numbers for the other collection of revenues. And I think it was actually an easy waste to win.
For him.
For him.
If he had a different tax message.
Yeah. He should have run on, he's a nice, good fellow, moderate Republican, should have run on his own moderation and ability to get along with people and, we're going to work out a better solution than this. He didn't need to do that. He didn't need to start by creating this budget hole and then try to paper it over. On a normal year, you probably could do that. But this was a population and a press corps and a political culture that had been through something unusual over several years. And it just came through that it was phony. You know, as you know better than I do, you can get away with a lot of phony rhetoric. And just get a he said, she said story and no way the public knows. But there's a limit. There's a point at which it says in the story, this is just not.
I've written that line myself, yes.
And he just, I think he was in the hands of consultants, and they had this theory, and they figured they couldn't possibly lose. They probably had, imagine what their polls showed.
Do consultants screw up campaigns more often than they carry them to successful conclusions?
I think it depends on what level. When you get to the level where the campaigns are conducted on the media, then the consultants are critical. They can screw them up, and they often do, but it isn't like you can make it by hand.
You need them.
Yeah, you need them. You're going to spend that kind of money. What they do is they tend to force campaigns down to the lowest common denominator, and they're afraid of staying the course. The other thing about the Byrne campaign, and the advantage of this centralization of it, was that we didn't bend. And that was true of the whole time. We stayed the course. We forced the public to reconsider the income tax. I believe that in 99% of the political cases, you would run through that scenario, the political people would fold. This is too hard, too much pain. We'll never survive this. And they almost confirmed the public skepticism by giving up. It wasn't really necessary. They didn't really do it.
Who was the major consultant to the Byrne campaign of '77?
We didn't really have one. Garth came back at the end and made some commercials. We had some commercials made early by a former associate of Garth's, Judy Press-Brenner. We didn't have a lot of commercials, though. It's a very different world we live in now. You know, in the primary in '73, we didn't have any television commercials.
You say it's a very different world we live in now. Given your experience with Brendan Byrne and your far more recent experience with John Corzine, is it any easier now to persuade New Jersey voters to accept taxes?
No, I don't think it's any easier. I think you have two or three things at worst. You have a culture that is skeptical about government and politics, and indeed has institutionalized opposition to them. I mean, I'm amused by the number of people who run for office declaiming the evils of politics and government, why they want to spend their time in such dens of iniquity is beyond me. They make whole careers up out of this, but it feeds this thing. Second thing is, you've had 30 years now because this is the time we're talking about is coterminous with the rise of anti-government, anti-tax sentiment, Proposition 13 in California. You've had all these years of promised tax reform, tax cuts, efficient government, the end of waste, fraud, and abuse, and nobody feels like anything's changed, except the very wealthy, who really do pay a lot less taxes. The average guy doesn't feel like Ronald Reagan did him any good, or his taxes any good, or George Bush did, or Christy Whitman did, or Brendan Byrne did. They just feel like... And the third thing is, because of what has happened to income and wealth, taxes are a bigger bite. When incomes were growing, as they were from World War II into the 70s, people could afford to pay additional taxes for more public services. But as their incomes have stagnated, it's more difficult for them. At the same time, people with the highest incomes, for whom it is not more difficult, have lower tax rates. I mean, when Eisenhower was president, the top rate was 91%.
What is it today? 40%? 38%?
No, it's about 36 32 effective, 36. And on unearned income, it's 15%. So it's a different world, and I think it's just as hard. The mechanisms for doing it have changed, though, because you can jump outside of the political day-to-day world we've been talking about all through this and use television to get a message out that supersedes all of the other messages. If you spend enough.
Can you in New Jersey?
Yeah, you can. I mean, I think John Corzine proves that. If
How?
you're willing to spend that kind of money, if you have that kind of money and you're willing to spend it, you can come out of nowhere. Bloomberg proves it in New York. You don't have to make the kind of door-to-door arguments, metaphorically, that you make within the political culture and the political system. Now, you've got to be willing to spend really a lot. You know, it doesn't help to spend an extra little 5 or 10 million. I don't know, it's a very troubling development, I think. But it becomes what people know. The reason advertising on television is so effective is it gets in people's heads and it becomes what they know about a topic. Not what they ought to know, not what they learned through some process, but what they remember.
After Byrne was reelected, what did you want to do personally?
I had been still planning to go to Washington, and then we cooked up after the election this absolutely crazy idea that I should run for the Senate.
Who's we?
Dagnan, Mulcahy, me, a bunch of us sitting around. There were a couple of reasons. One was Bradley was talking about running. I was convinced that Case was in trouble. So this was not a quixotic race.
Case
Clifford
was
Case
a
was
long-time
the
Republican
senator,
U.S. Senator from
and
New
I was
Jersey.
convinced that he was in trouble in his own party, which turned out to be true. Secondly, Bill Bradley had run away from Byrne in '77. We'd asked him to campaign, and he refused to support the tax.
Was he campaigning for the
campaign.
Senate already
Yeah.
for the following
He
year?
did campaign, but he wouldn't support the tax. And for those of us who'd lived through what we'd lived through, that was pretty tough. That was pretty tough. And, you know, he hadn't paid his dues, I guess you'd say, and he hadn't, even on that issue. On a more personal level, I didn't think I had any chance of beating Bill Bradley in the primary. But you never knew. I mean, was he really going to run? Would he hate it? You know, the guy was brand new to it. The real decision for me was about whether to drop out in April. I decided I would run until the last filing date, and then I could drop out if, you know, if Bill Bradley turned out to be a great candidate. And the illusion that I talked about, the difference between experience you're having and experience for it, is that we would go around places and we'd appear before these Democratic audiences, and then they'd all endorse me, because Bill was a terrible speaker when he started out that first time. I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
And I would, you know, clobber him up in Bergen and Burlington and Trenton and the Princeton Democratic Club. Didn't amount to anything, even down in Cherry Hill. And we began to get the idea, well, gee, you know, it's not going to hold up, but that turned out to be a an additional handicap, which was I couldn't raise any money. So
And he could?
Should have dropped
Or
down.
he used his own?
Used his own, and he could raise it.
But the experience you were having told you at filing deadline time that you should stay in it.
I was having fun, and I figured I'd never have a chance to do this again. That's really I sat around with Gordon McInnes and a couple of other people, and I said, it's another 6 or 7 weeks out of my life. It's the only time I'll ever get to do this.
As I recall, Gordon McInnes was your campaign
He was
manager.
my campaign manager.
And
Blair
his
was
wife
Bill's
manager. That couldn't happen today, could it?
Probably not. Bill had asked me to be the chairman of his campaign.
At what point in time?
Oh, back before the first of the year.
What'd you
Before
say?
I got into it. I said if I don't run, I will do it. But I'm thinking about running.
Even though you were disappointed in him for not having embraced the tax?
Well, there wasn't anybody else out there. We wanted one of us to run. We didn't really have a good candidate. I wasn't a good candidate. We didn't really have a good candidate.
You were
Degnan was not, had not been Attorney General. He probably could have been a good candidate.
You were Brendan Byrne's candidate in the primary.
Sort of.
Well, we in the media thought you were.
Yeah, well, Brendan felt he had to support me. He didn't think it was a very good idea. His political judgment was better than mine.
What'd you lose by?
There were 3 of us. There was Alex Menza. We shouldn't forget Alex, who ran in that race. Bill got about 50% of the vote. I got about 35% of the vote, and Alex got about 15% of the vote. Don't hold me to those numbers, but I think that's about right. Alex is very sick, I understand.
Is he?
Yeah. Seriously.
How tough was it for you organizing your own campaign after managing campaigns for others?
It wasn't tough because we didn't have much of a campaign. We had 2 or 3 staff people. We had no money. It was easy. I mean, it was just a case. We spent less than $200,000. These other campaigns, by contemporary standards, they weren't big, but they were huge by New Jersey standards. Big staffs. And we had 4 or 5 people. Literally.
So you called all the shots like you did on prior campaigns?
No. Gordon called the shots. You can't run your own campaign. You don't know what's happening.
No?
There weren't many shots to be called. We got, some endorsements. We had no television. I think we had 7 or 8 appearances on paid television. We made 1 spot.
In hindsight, are you glad you did it?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I'd never have done it otherwise. And I learned a lot of things about what it's like to do it.
What'd you learn?
I learned that you actually see the world differently when you're doing it yourself. And and that is important in understanding how to deal with people who've done it. It's a very different experience. Most of the time, you're surrounded by people who are for you. In the nature of the case, you would get hecklers or something maybe here and there, but by and large, the people who bother to come to things and bother to talk to you, bother to have anything to do with you, are for you, and they talk a lot about what they want, what they need, and you get a very distorted view of the world. And you occasionally go up against your opponent, which is, in my case, was kind of fun. Although Bill stopped coming after a while to those events. It just, for me, because I'd done the other kinds of stuff, it was great to sit through an interview or to go to a meeting and say what was on my mind the way I wanted to say it, and not try to influence the way somebody would say it. More often, it was liberating.
Did Brendan Byrne talk to you on election night, do you recall?
think so. I don't know whether it was election night or the day after,
What
or
did he say?
during the day. I don't know. I don't remember anything particularly about it, but he supported me publicly. I presume he voted for me. I know Gene did.
Gene Byrne.
Yeah.
How do you know?
He was a fan.
James Carville once said to me, in fact, after the Florio defeat, the night of the Florio defeat in New Jersey, and he had been a consultant to Florio in '93, he said, "Michael, as good as it feels to win, it feels 1,000 times worse to lose." Did you have that experience?
No. I knew I was going to lose. I thought I was going to lose, and then that grew into a certainty. In the last month, I just was kind of like, we were having a good time because it wasn't. By then, there started to be polls, and for me, it was liberating. I'd gotten it out of my system. I've never been a person who. People always say, well, "Don't you miss being treasurer or miss being chairman of the Port Authority?" I don't miss things like that. First of all, I like private life, and I like being done with that. And,
From the outside, how did you view Brendan Byrne's second term?
I thought it was remarkably successful. He took on so many different issues, and the place functioned so much better as an operation and politically.
Why?
Well, part of it was learning. People were seasoned, and they'd learn more, and Brendan learned more. And part of it was they just had people who were more politically skillful at dealing with politics at that level, with the legislature, with the groups.
Who?
Well, I've mentioned some of them. And I think I'm trying to think about the cabinet in the second term. As I've told you, I thought Degnan was terrific. And I think that was significant.
The Pinelands was in the second term.
Pineland was major.
Was that the thing Brendan Byrne should be remembered for, or is it the income tax, or is there something else that belongs in the same sentence?
I guess there's something more general that I would say he should be remembered for. I think he brought a degree of intelligence and class and independence to the job that, at least for this generation, a couple of generations, is seen as the standard. Partly it's his sense of humor, partly it's that he's carried on. But I think the Pinelands and the income tax and the re-election and all of it is of a piece. That he's seen as managing problems that came up in a way that was admirable, as running a completely honest administration, attracting very good people, and coming out of it with his reputation enhanced, which is not so typical of what happens to people in politics.
That's true.
And he did not really have a sag at the end.
It was all kind of an upward.
It was all upward. And I think
What were your contacts with Brendan Byrne and others in the administration once you left it?
oh, they were episodic. I wound up going to Wall Street because I couldn't resist the money. So that took me away during the day a lot, and I would go to things. I mean, I still had friends who I stayed in touch with, and I would see Brendan and things. But we drifted away. I'd say the last year or two. It was not something that I talked to anybody once a week, be less, once a month maybe.
Byrne was elected when New Jersey was in its worst economic situation since the Depression.
Mm-hmm.
How did that affect administration policies?
Well, it put a tremendous squeeze on us because we had no revenue growth. And because we were trying to do things that people didn't feel the state could afford. It had a plus, though, which is most of the administration was during a period when we were coming out of bad times, which is much better for you than if you start during a boom and much of your administration is about going down economically. People tend to blame governors for things they can't control, like the economy. Governors all claim to have great effects on the economy. Of course, the data shows they don't have effects on the economy. Data also show that they lose when the economy's real bad and they get reelected when the economy's good.
Governors have not even a marginal effect on the economy?
Little effect on the margin, not big effects. Not big effects. Swamped by interest rates, by big movements in the economy.
They sure run on
They do.
that.
They do. That's, motherhood. It's something that everybody's for, economic growth.
Given that you had so little room and that times were tight, did you have any kind of problems with organized labor, political problems?
Given how little we gave them, it's amazing how well we got along with them. I am mystified by it. I think I have probably an unrealistic view of one's ability to get along with them, because my relationships with them were so good.
Is that just Democrat to Democrat?
No, I don't think so. Not when you're not giving them anything. I suspect, and I have no evidence of this, somebody who knows the history of labor, that they must have been pretty secure leadership, a leadership group. Because usually it makes it hard to get along with labor as if the leaders of labor are under great pressure from the rank and file, and they need to deliver stuff to them. For them to carry all this bad news back and support it, well, of course, they were for the income tax, support us, things like that. I think they must have been pretty secure, and that was not of our doing. That might have been just a historical coincidence.
Was Brendan Byrne, you say he brought intelligence class to the office. You used one other word that escapes me at the moment. Was he the greatest governor of modern times?
Well, I think in terms of the fights he took on and what he accomplished, he was. I judge people in public life by the fights they take on. And I judge them pretty well if they take on difficult fights because they think they're right. And then there's a whole other standard, which is, are they successful? And are the things they did validated? And Brendan was unique in the last 30 or 40 years in having taken them on, done the right thing, had the people's stamp of approval on that. That's pretty hard to do. Not a lot of examples of that around the country.
You told us that after the election of '78, you went off to Wall Street.
Yeah, 79.
'79. How difficult was it to adjust after all this, the cauldron of the public sector, to adjust to the private sector?
It was very, it was a big change for me. One of the reasons my contacts were limited was I really had to learn. I mean, I've done these things on Wall Street, but I had to learn them. I mean, they were not related to anything I'd ever done before. They were totally different. I had to learn the oil business. I had to learn about futures and options. I had to learn about capital markets and treasury. I worked very hard. The difference, though, was one profound difference. I didn't care what happened to any of the places I worked for. People used to think on Wall Street, particularly later when I was at Dillon Reed, running trading operations and things, that I was an amazingly cool customer because I didn't get worked up about what was happening. Truth is, I didn't care. I mean, I care about the public sector, and I care about things that affect people's lives. I don't care whether somebody's bonus goes up or down, or whether
Didn't
the
you
market
care
goes
about
up
whether
or
you
down.
care about your own performance?
I always try to do my best. But if I'd had to do something else the next day, it would have been, oh my God, I'm never going to be looking at oil futures again in my life. It's just not the same. First of all, the people who do it, You know, Brendan presided over a band that was emotionally attached to one another, really felt they were part of something bigger. They really cared about it. It's hard to describe. They were in this thing together. I never felt that way. Because, I mean, it's very pleasant. People would, you'd have a better glass of vodka if you had a drink afterwards, and you did other things. It's social. But, you know, must be like baseball is today. Somebody might be traded or become a free agent the next year or go away. Or, you know, it was just not, you were not attached to something larger. There were no links that were bigger than how much we were going to get paid. And on Wall Street, that's particularly true. I mean, on Wall Street is about how much you're going to be paid. It's about how much you want to make money. Everything else is wallpaper.
You told us earlier that Tom Kane appointed you to the Port Authority. Why? What was your relationship with Kane?
I had known Kane forever, you know, since I was a kid in Trenton and he was a kid in Trenton. And we'd always gotten along. You know, argued about policy. Worst thing I ever said to him was that he was becoming another Jim Woolworth. Do you remember Jim Woolworth?
Certainly.
Which,
Woolworth came out of the woodworks to run for governor again in '93.
so we had quite a good relationship, but I had not spoken to Tom for 2 years. And one day I got a call at my office at Dillon Reed, and it was Tom. And he said, how are you? And I said, how are you? She said, it's been a long time. And he said, let me ask you a question. If I appointed you to the Port Authority, would you serve? And I said, well, sure, I guess so. He said, well, I'm going to do that this afternoon. I haven't told anybody. And that part of it's actually true. I mean, it was subsequently confirmed by anybody. And I had, it was an odd thing to say, but I said, why? He said, I can't appoint anybody up there who doesn't go native and isn't become, you know, a creature of the Port Authority. They all forget everything. And he put my name in the afternoon, shocking everybody in his office.
Because you're a Democrat.
I'm a Democrat. I wasn't part of anything. I mean, I wasn't on anybody's radar screen. Most people, probably half of them thought I was dead. Not as many. I mean, when John asked me to be the transition director, that was when a lot of people thought he was dead to turn up again after that many years. But the Kane thing was out of nowhere. And
you say, I want you to be chairman, or are you going to...
No, that came up later. You know, this was 4 years. This was 2 years before I became chairman. That was partly related to other changes that were going on the board. And so he did put my name, and it came down for a hearing. Much confusion about what to say or to ask me.
It was?
Well, yeah, I think people remembered me from 10 years earlier, you know, and had nothing recent to talk about. And Phil Kaltenbacher was the chairman then.
Okay, right. Kaltenbacher, who had been Kane's running mate.
And he was, a year or two later, in fact, going to change his residence and move to Florida. He is one of the people who moved away, who has a lot of money.
How did you try to change the Port Authority?
Port Authority had 2 or 3 problems. I mean, I'd followed the Port Authority since I was in graduate school. I consider myself something of a student of it. And I'd been up there with Hughes, I'd been up there with Byrne, I had my own views about it. It had become too political. It is much more political now than it was then. So I failed utterly at that, and we were going to try to professionalize it. And there were some important milestones in that, including telling Governor Cuomo that he couldn't have the executive director he wanted, which is if we're doing interviews on another time, I'll tell you that story, which was a subject of some difficulty, in which Jim Florio comes out pretty tough, pretty strong.
Good.
So the second thing was it had to bend with the times. It still had little drawers next to the commissioners' desks that were humidors for the cigars. It didn't have public meetings. You know that?
No.
There were guys still commuting by helicopter.
Kathleen Donovan used to take the helicopter and she got criticized for that.
So I went after all those things, and I opened up the meetings to the public, which was supposed to mean the end of life as we know it, but it turned out not. I mean, it was kind of a pain at first. I actually had informal meetings with the public to show that it wasn't so bad, and they were horrible. They were like 4-hour yelling sessions. And I had them out in New Jersey and New York so that people could actually come in the evening. And that convinced everybody this is a terrible idea.
What exactly does it mean when you say that it's now more political than it was even then? What does that mean?
Well, everything gets split, right, between the states. The jobs get split up. Who knows what else, all the decisions. It used to be quite, that was what people complained about. It used to be far too independent an agency, and nobody owned it. And everybody got promoted through the ranks.
It was the premier public service agency in the region.
Yeah, everybody got promoted. Anyway, so and at the same time, the third thing was, it had to bend and not break, so you had to be a little more politically responsive to the agendas of the governors, because they get elected. And you had to refashion those agendas in ways that were constructive and that were not merely political. And that would save the agency, in my misguided view, I think, from being politicized, if it were responsive and people came to, again, to cherish. I mean, people put up with its independence because it was so good at what it did. It could do things you couldn't do. Well, it just turned out that that time is over. And no matter how good it was at what it could do, they wanted the jobs. And it has changed.
Why don't you tell us that story about Mario Cuomo?
Well, when Steve Berger decided to leave,
he was executive
director.
A New Yorker.
New Yorker. I got a call one weekend from the governor's person on the board saying the governor's picked an executive director. I'm not going to tell you who it was because it's actually not a fellow who is an able man. And I said, well, we'll take a look at it. And there's this long pause on the, no, you don't understand. He wants it done right away. And I said, I'm not going to do that. It's not the way it's going to work. So there was another long pause and said, well, I guess we have to talk to the governor of New Jersey. You can talk to anybody you want, It's not going to happen that way. So they did reach out for Florio, and Florio said, no, he owns the chairman. I didn't appoint him. He's the chairman. And as I understand it, it has to have a majority from both states to support the candidate. So they were really off the wall. And I knew, and I still know Mario well. I mean, we're friends. So I get another call about this. Why not? And I said, because I'm not opposed to...
Same person or another person?
Same person. I'm not opposed, I said, to a New Yorker having this job. I understand that now that's the tradition. It didn't used to be. I said, but then it ought to be the best New York produces. How about somebody like Stan Bresnoff, who's the most able person I've seen on the New York side in many, many years. And I said, anybody who can be deputy mayor to Ed Koch and be successful at it must be good enough to run this agency. So we went round and round anyway. In the fullness of time, they did finally settle on Stan Bresnoff. We played that as their own idea, so everybody was happy. But that was the last time I think that'll ever happen.
That a chairman says no to a governor.
Yeah.
Tell us a little more about the role of authorities like that one and their relation with state government.
Well, they become much more important when, going back to the Hughes and Byrne years, they were not very important. The Port Authority was a colossus, and there were a few other little authorities that did things that nobody paid much attention to. Now they become a vehicle for politics and patronage and decision-making that's pervasive. And they've been abused. I remember during the transition trying to understand the job of the authorities council in the counsel's office, which I assumed was some kind of oversight role to make sure that what the minutes should be or whether the governor's policy was being implemented. But apparently in not so distant past, it's been the place where you made sure the contracts and legal work were going to the right people. So one of the things that's instructive is the person who's the authorities counsel under John Corzine is a former assistant U.S. attorney, which has been quite a trauma, as I understand it, to many people in politics. It's not somebody you can even talk to. So authorities have become very important. They're huge. They have an enormous outstanding debt equal to the debt of the state, roughly. I don't know if that debt's been managed properly or if that burden can be met by resources. I do think they need to be reorganized, quite apart from this monetization or privatization or any of those things. I think you've got to restructure the authorities.
Restructure them in what sense?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's the study that's being done. I think that's a massive job. It's not on my plate.
You are in charge of re-engineering
Well, I'm looking at,
government
yeah, but
panel.
we're looking selectively at 4 or 5 areas. I mean, that's a whole project for somebody. That's been a way to steer around all of the rules and the borrowing restrictions and market pressures and sunshine and scrutiny. And I think probably some wholesale reorganization would be worthwhile there. I don't know.
What did you do at the Mercantile Exchange?
My claim to fame is we started the first successful oil futures market in the world.
Really?
They said it couldn't be done.
Why did they say it couldn't be done?
Well, what I was told by everybody was that, because of the cartel and the big companies, the price is set. It's administered. And it used to be that Exxon would post the price in New York Harbor for gasoline and heating oil, and they'd post the price for sweet crude in Cushing, Oklahoma, or in St. James Parish, Louisiana, and that was the price. Everything was priced off that by so many cents. And that sounded plausible to me that you couldn't have a futures market until I poked around a little bit. And I talked to some people who knew about futures, and they said, oh, the grain market's like that. There are 2 or 3 companies control all the grain. And the cattle market's like that. There are a few countries that control all the cattle. And I said, well, then how does the futures work? And they said, well, they can't really beat an open market because the market will take advantage of their price if it's off. So you print money for a while, and then they'll give up. And there were no experts in this field, so I hired several bright people from the Woodrow Wilson School, especially one named Josh Rosenthal, who stayed on and died on 9/11. And these kids, I don't take any credit for it really, figured out how you could trade oil futures. And we did it. And I remember the day 2 years later when Exxon announced they weren't going to post prices anymore, that their price would be the NYMEX price at close. And it was kind of fun. I mean, I wouldn't claim any of us knew what we were doing, but we learned a lot. I learned a lot. It's an interesting business, oil business.
Yeah?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, it's 50 million barrels of oil move every day around the world. So it's like a kid's thing, trucks and cars, and ships and planes, and it's huge amounts of resources. Tremendously political. The oil's all in all the wrong places. Crazy countries where relationships matter. Real characters. Fortunes made and lost. It's still pretty wild. And it's a big part of the economy that I knew nothing about. Zero about. So I kind of keep track of it a little bit.
Did you play a role in the Mondale campaign for president?
I took some time in the primary to do the New Jersey primary. Then I worked on the convention. I was called a
against
special advisor.
Gary Hart?
Yeah. And Gary got no delegates.
From New Jersey?
None in New Jersey.
You're proud of that?
Well, Gary's a friend of mine, but that was the right thing.
Well, Gary insulted New Jersey 2 days before the primary.
That's right. Tom Kane and I were all over that. Remember, Mrs. Kane gave Fritz Mondale a New Jersey T-shirt the next time he came in. And then I organized a program for the convention, which was really great fun. And then I took a month off in the fall and worked on speeches and things like that.
At headquarters?
Yeah, in Washington.
In Washington. Where was the convention that year?
San Francisco. It's a great convention.
Would you have taken a job in that administration had you won?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a big fan of Walter Mondale. That was the only political thing I did during the 12 years I was on Wall Street. But I've known Mondale since '68, so.
What do you think of Mondale?
I think he's a great American, would have been a great president. I think he had the misfortune that it fell out that he had to try it against Ronald Reagan, and that all Ronald Reagan had to do was prove that he still had his wits about him and he was going to get reelected. He almost blew it.
A couple of years.
Yeah. No, it's a tough race.
What's Mondale like as a person? What kind of guy is he? Is he intellectually curious? Is he?
Yeah, he's intellectually curious, amazingly rigorous. He's probably tougher than most people I've known, and insisting on facts being checked, the arguments being thorough. Probably a very good lawyer. But he's very accessible and easygoing. There's no pomp or circumstance or status or hierarchy. I mean, everybody calls him Fritz, you know, people who work on him. He's an easygoing guy. He's not one of these egos. Not, you know, most politicians. You ever seen this movie, The Devil Wears Prada?
Yeah.
You know that woman who's the head of the magazine?
Meryl Streep.
Most politicians are just like that. But not all. The ones I like and work for are not like that.
They didn't throw their coat on your desk.
So I can't take that.
Mondale also supported tax hikes in that '84
That was
campaign.
against everybody's advice. That was Mondale. That has been attributed to many people, but I can tell you because I was actually out there getting ready for the convention. And he said, I'm putting this in the speech. Marty Kaplan actually wrote the lines. And Jim Johnson, who was his chairman of his campaign, and I said, you know, that's not a very good idea. He said, I know what you're thinking. You think I'll lose if you'll do that, if I do that. And what we were thinking is you're going to lose anyway. And we said something to that effect. No, I don't think you'll lose it on this. And he said, look, these guys are creating an unbelievable budget hole. They're going to savage people for decades because of this deficit. And I'm going to tell the truth about it. So, you know, at that point, what do you do? I mean, there wasn't any conventional way to run that race. It wasn't like he could have said, I'm going to cut your taxes more than Ronald Reagan, or... So he did it. I don't think it was very significant because he actually came out of the convention, which was a great convention, ahead of what Reagan and, you know, those polls don't mean anything. He had the convention bounce. And then the next week, Jerry Ferraro hit the wall and the bottom fell out. I mean, he was going to lose anyway, but it was the Ferraro thing that knocked the bottom out of that campaign. That was a disaster.
But he was going to lose anyway.
Yeah. I don't see how he could have won.
You told us about the tax hike, the creation of the income tax in 1976 and what a tough fight it was and how it almost cost Brendan Byrne re-election, but that he prevailed. The next great tax saga in New Jersey political history comes in 1990 when newly elected Governor Jim Florio hikes the sales and income tax simultaneously. And the following year, his party loses its majorities in the legislature. Veto-proof Republican majorities are elected. They roll back one of the taxes. To what extent do you think that Jim Florio thought that he could duplicate what Brendan Byrne had done and survive the introduction of the tax?
I wouldn't, couldn't speak with any certainty, but from my recollection of some conversations I had with people involved, they had a belief that they were compelled to fix the school aid formula, and that they probably would have to do something with general revenues to keep the budget balanced for 4 years, and that they would be better off packaging all of that in one massive program, getting it through, having a whole term to have it work and have people forget the intensity of the reaction and get over it, and that the Byrne lesson was partly that if you don't get it right away, your whole term as governor is one long agony about taxes. You know, but we're all products of our experience. I thought that the long process under Byrne had educated the public to the need and had been a significant factor in his reelection. I didn't think that it had to go on for years, but I thought, you know, this is a month, 6 months, a year and a half part, and so I would say maybe in pieces. Who's to say, though? I mean, they did get the package through, which surprised me. They had some people who had lived through the tax fight, including Steve Persky, who was the initial chief of staff and had been in the middle of this fight as a legislator. And they almost got reelected. I mean, Jim Floyd lost by a point or something. And many factors could have determined that outcome. I think any time you do a major tax program, you're at risk politically, and you're likely to be punished. And I think actually legislators are right to worry about that. People do not have strong, deep, abiding loyalties to their state legislators. And those races are often not very visible, and it's easy to just pull one lever or the other. The stability we have in legislative elections is probably because of reapportionment rather than the way the districts are drawn, rather than the unique personal qualities of individual legislators and their relationship with their constituents. So it's hard to raise taxes. It was when Hughes put the sales tax in, when the first sales tax went in 1966, Hughes had strong Democratic majorities. In 1967, the Republicans took over both houses. There were other factors, other unpopular things. It doesn't have to happen that way. The odd thing is with Byrne, is that after he got the tax in 76 and 77, the Democrats held on to the legislature. And that was a very bitterly fought tax. So I think these things are complicated. I've actually, years ago, looked at the result around the country whenever these taxes were passed, what happens in the subsequent election. And it's very mixed.
You're a close advisor to the current governor, John Corzine, who just pushed through a penny hike in the sales tax. Is he going to be Brendan Byrne, or is he going to be Jim Florio?
I think John Corzine has such an extensive agenda, massive reorganization of the way services are provided and paid for, particularly this property tax reform mission he has set for himself in the broadest terms, that the sales tax hike of a penny will only be a small piece of what people have to look at when they come to make their judgments in the re-election campaign. If this were the be-all and end-all, the one big thing that happened, the way it was for the people we're talking about, then maybe you could make some judgment about it. And since it's small, relatively speaking, I don't think it would be a big negative. But he's put other mountains out there to climb. I mean, some of them maybe he had to climb, some he saw them and said, now that's a mountain I should climb. And he's got a pretty ambitious agenda, and he's not done yet. He wants to have new statewide elected officials. He wants to hold property tax growth to a minimum. He wants to reform the school aid formula, which means some get more, some get less. He wants to take on pensions for state employees. He wants to create a new health care plan for state employees they'd have to pay into. I mean, by the time you get done, I know he's got, and there are 5 or 6 other things in the queue that he plans to take on. So people are going to, I think, make a different kind of judgment about John Corzine, which will be he set about to reform state government and we think he's on the right track, or he tried to do too much and, you know, this is all disappointing or upsetting to individual groups, and so we'll have to see.
How about the legislature? Will they pay a price a year from now?
I think the legislature is having a difficult time adjusting to John Corzine. He's fresh and open, and he talks about what he's thinking. And he's not a game player. And there was a sense, I think, that because he was inexperienced in Trenton, that the legislature could go on ruling the state as it has the last couple of years. I think we're back to a more normal situation where the governor's the principal leader on policy and the legislature participates. So they'll have to adjust, and it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. They can be self-destructive in adjusting. They can make themselves the object of much animosity from the public, because I think they just learned with the closing of the state government that they came out worse than he came out, which is hard to do, given that the governor's out there invisible and legislature is kind of this amorphous thing. They can do more of that, or they can work more constructively. I think we'll see as we go on. I think, the legislature is not one person. There are different people in different places. So I guess I'd say it's too soon to tell about both.
You talked about the broad agenda. In your view, is it too ambitious?
Not for the situation we're in. I think it takes somebody new to be willing to take on this much. I think anybody who'd been around a long time would be so conscious of the constraints and the difficulties that they would say we need to be very focused and pick a couple of fights that we can win and then move from there. I think a reasonable person coming in, man or woman, and takes a look at this says, what a mess, let's fix this up. Here are all the things we need to do. I don't know, it's unprecedented in my experience, and it'd be interesting to see where it goes.
Corzine asked you to be his transition director. Why you?
The election night, I was up in the suite having, I don't remember, somebody took me up there, as a matter of fact. I can't even remember who it was exactly. I was wandering around the hotel. Somebody took me up to this suite, and the television announced, since they confirmed reality, that Corzine was the winner. And John grabbed me by the arm and he pulled me into the next room, closed the door, and he said, I want you to chair my transition. And I was floored. I said, what do you mean? Well, what's the transition operation look like? And he said, I didn't have one. I didn't want to jinx anything, which is crazy, by the way. You should always have one. It's not a jinx. And I said, gee, I don't know that I can do that. He said, come on, it'll be fun. Take a couple of months, take a leave from the foundation, have some fun. I said, let me think about this for a day or so.
What had been your relationship with John Corzine?
I met him years and years ago, but, we barely knew each other. Then in the 90s, we were both on a federal commission to study capital budgets. He chaired it. And we really hit it off. We became friends in the course of that. I never imagined he would be running for public office in New Jersey. And as a matter of fact, when we had lunch, I don't know what year this would have been, 99 maybe? This is 3 or 4 years, maybe 4 or 5 years later. And he said, I think I'm going to run for the Senate in New Jersey. And I told him I thought it was crazy. So that's how good my advice is. But I was not involved in the Senate campaign at all. I said I couldn't be involved because I had a relationship with Jim Florio, and
They ran against each other in the primary.
In the primary, and I wouldn't do anything against Jim Florio. And so I said, if you win the primary, give me a call. Well, he won the primary, but he never gave me a call. But then we did hook up again once he went to the Senate, and we were together a number of times, always issue-oriented stuff where I'm doing work at the foundation that's related to it, or Social Security reform was a major interest of ours at the foundation, and John was involved in that. And He called me right after McGreevy made his famous announcement. And I was in Vermont, I think. And I was probably the last person in New Jersey to be aware that there was a problem with Jim McGreevy.
Same day?
A day or two later. And he said, I might have to get into this thing. It might not last. And it was, initially, John was only thinking of running for governor, I believe, in the context of, I'd have to step in because otherwise, you know, we'd lose the governorship, but not that he would leave the Senate. He said, I've got to go to school on state issues. And we started working intensively that fall. And I think he really came to believe that he loved the job. And that's because he found it so much more interesting to have this range of issues and decisions. And we set up a series of seminars for him with people who were experts from around the state, and we put together panels.
Who's we?
Well, I guess mostly me. And many of the people we've been talking about, I brought in to sit with him and talk to him about stuff. And then because his own staff was still preoccupied in Washington. And then the campaign began to get rolling.
Did you have a role in the campaign?
No, I didn't. I actually, for periods of time, I wouldn't be involved at all, because these campaigns are highly professional, and the people in the campaigns really know what they're doing, and I'm out of date about day-to-day politics in New Jersey. I'd often be called in about some issue, like property taxes, which was a growing issue, or the state budget. And then sometimes if there was a perceived crisis, which there often are in campaigns, they'd call a bunch of people together and talk about how to deal with it.
You say that Corzine hadn't done any transition planning because he didn't want to jinx himself. We in the press thought everything was a little slow during that transition, also in part because he had the immediate decision of replacing himself in the U.S. Senate, and that decision seemed to dominate the first couple of weeks of the transition.
Yeah, see, I would have waited till the very end on that decision. I mean, I wouldn't have cared what the press said. I would have kept everybody hanging till the very end. But that's...
Why did he want to get that out of the way?
He had this strong view that the sooner he got it out of the way, the stronger the person would be that he picked.
Disagree?
I think it's complicated. It's complicated by the fact that he was going to confront as governor a great many difficult choices. And there's some argument that a wide open primary would insulate the candidate from John Corzine's decisions about taxes and other things. But other than that, I think the argument for an early choice was correct. I think he was right about that. It indicated definitive preference, definitive belief that somebody was best suited for it. And so I think on balance, he probably did the right thing. The transition was slow starting because there had been no early work, and also because of the extraordinary ethics-related measures we went through to even determine who could be part of the transition. Nobody's ever done that before. And had I realized how time-consuming that would be, we might have made a modification and asked for understanding that we were going to do something simplified. But using the state forms, disclosure forms, and having them gone over, I mean, first of all, a normal human being says, I'm not going to fill all this out so I can come to a meeting. So that became a bit of a difficulty, although in the end I think it worked out pretty well.
How did the Corzine transition differ from the Byrne transition that you managed?
Well, I think Corzine was much more involved in the details of the transition, which is the way he is about everything. I think in the Byrne transition we had a much better idea who the people were we wanted in advance. governor and I had a lot in common, a lot of common knowledge, a lot of common opinions about people. So we could shape that. More of the Bern key players were in the campaign. I think that there were some disadvantages that I had in my role, and that I knew the state and I knew the people much better under Bern than I did under Corzine. On the other hand, he has some exceptional young people who helped to make up for that. I mean, I think that, you know, the transition was a group of people who were really all relatively young, except for me, one or two others. Susan, who passed in.
How about John Corzine and Brendan Byrne? Are there similarities there, or are they very different?
They both needed work as speakers when they started, and they both got better. You see how far John could go. Well, there are some similarities. They're not either of them people who particularly sit through a meeting and say, well, politically we need to do this, or we'll get killed if we do that. It doesn't come up that way. They have self-depreciating humor about themselves, self-depreciating humor, which makes everything a little bit more tolerable. I mean, John works harder. It isn't that Brendan doesn't work hard, but John really isn't. You know, he's working like he must have worked as an associate on Wall Street. He just works 7 days a week, early in the morning, and has no thought about anything other than that. Brendan was steeped in and internalized the politics of the state and understood the subtleties of it and the people. And I think John Corzine is still learning that. I think John is more optimistic about people than Brendan was. And I'm sad to say that he may become more like Brendan the more he interacts with these people.
Corzine is more of a detail guy than Byrne?
Yeah. Byrne got pretty detailed about the budget, though. But I never saw anybody work on the budget the way John Corzine did.
Which was how?
Just came to understand the budget. I mean, he got in endless detail in meetings and stuff. It's like, and he's somewhat of a shock. He shocks people in the government
By
how much he knows. When he has a meeting about the school aid form, a meeting about some other thing, really.
you had said that when you started putting these seminars together, you could sense that Corzine saw this was a job that he could love. People say he loves the job.
That's what he says.
What do you think?
Even on the worst day, he says he loves the job. I think he does love it. I think he likes the range of issues and being at the center of the action all the time. I think he was frustrated in the Senate by being in the minority and in the minority of the minority on things because he's a young senator, new senator. And here there are things thrown at him every day that are a crisis, and he likes that. Doesn't bother him.
You see him going farther?
I think that if he could accomplish all he sets out to accomplish, anything's possible. But because the agenda is so extraordinary and the need is so acute, and the state's such a mess, it's not a job. I mean, I wouldn't pick this job for somebody in order to groom them for higher office. It's a mess. I mean, suppose he does everything he wants to do. People will say, you know, he raised taxes, he cut this, he did that, he's got the teachers mad at him. I mean, timing is everything, and this is a bad time to have this job.
Do you think he would like to go to the White House?
I don't know if he'd want to go through the process. If you could appoint a president, I think he'd say he could handle it, but I don't think he'd want to run. It was a pretty unpleasant election campaign, particularly towards the end.
I think we should make this the last question.
Yeah,
I talked about this.
Okay.
All right. If you were able to change New Jersey government today to do anything, what would you do? What would you change?
Just within the government, or change something about New Jersey that I think would change the government?
Well, we'll take that.
Oh, I think if you could have, 3 commercial television stations here with news show every night, that would change things for
How
the
so?
better. It would lead to more transparency and exposure, and people would have to explain things. The public would be engaged in a different way. I mean, with all due respect to what we've got, we know what the percentage is, or read the newspapers, or do other things. They move, through a fog, the people in New Jersey. I think they'd do a lot better if they knew more
About their government.
about their government and actually saw the people. And these people had mics stuck in front of them all the time. I mean, some of that goes on, but it's not like it's going to be on the news everywhere tonight and people are actually going to see it. Had to answer questions about it. Had to be held accountable about it. If you said one thing, I mean, that's the one thing that I think would make a difference. Or maybe if the public were compelled every night to watch an hour of television or listen to an hour of radio where an issue was discussed by a panel. I mean, we make so many bad decisions and so many bad things happen because people don't know, or because people think the public will never know. It'll never get out.
How long have you been at the Century Foundation?
Since 1990.
You've been the president of it since then.
Yeah.
And I think you told us in our first interview that you love this job.
It's really fun.
Why?
Well, I mean, I would rather be exercising real authority, but I've learned in the course of my life that you rarely get to do that. And I love public policy, and those issues really matter to me. I think they really affect people's lives. And this is a place, it's quite a small place, that looks at a lot of different areas of public policy. I usually get to choose them. So smart people sit around and think and write and do research and publish about how we ought to do things, how we ought to make decisions, how we might do things better, and try to influence the course of the debate, influence people who do have authority. It's frustrating in that we don't have much influence, and particularly given the era I have, particularly the last 6 years. But the topics themselves are fascinating. So they range from Homeland Security to taxes to Medicare to election reform.
You're a think tank.
Yeah, we're a think tank. No, we have a great bunch of people. Most of them have been with us quite a while now. There's some movement. We have some brilliant young people who I have great hopes for. We do a lot with young people. In the summer, we have programs that have about 150 summer interns. I mean, I'm at the stage of my life now where having an effect on young people is the most important thing I do.
2 last questions. How should young people regard Brendan Byrne?
I think young people should regard him as somebody who put in place a foundation for good government in New Jersey. It's still there if the right people will only make it go. They owe him a lot. It just was not there before Brendan Byrne.
How should young people who have any connection to this state regard this state of New Jersey?
Well, New Jersey takes a terrible beating in the media for scandals and the turnpike and pollution. It's actually a pretty fantastic place with a highly educated, well-off population. It's thrown together in a lot of density. You can do almost anything you want here if you do it, if you want to do it. So I think, I think, I'm sorry my own daughter went to Washington and didn't stay here and get involved in government and politics. But since that's what I wanted to do, I'm glad one of us got out.